Inconsistent stories. Inconsistent stories emerge when truth is no longer stable inside someone's mind. When a person is aligned with honesty, their experiences exist as a single, coherent narrative. When betrayal begins to form, that narrative fractures. Details shift, timelines blur, and explanations subtly change depending on the moment, the audience, or the pressure applied. These inconsistencies are rarely dramatic lies. They appear as small contradictions that are easy to dismiss at first. A time mentioned earlier no longer matches. A reason given once is replaced by a different one later. The story feels familiar yet slightly altered, creating a lingering sense that something doesn't quite add up. This is because deception requires constant mental adjustment, and the brain struggles to perfectly reconstruct fabricated or edited versions of reality. What makes this signal emotionally triggering is the psychological tension it creates in you. You begin replaying conversations, questioning your memory, wondering if you misunderstood. This self-questioning slowly shifts trust away from your intuition and toward their version of events. The more often the story changes, the more exhausting it becomes to keep track of what is true. Inconsistent stories also reveal divided attention. When someone is managing multiple emotional realities, they lose the ability to anchor themselves in a single truth. Each version of the story serves a purpose in the moment, rather than reflecting reality as it is. Over time, these inconsistencies erode emotional safety. You stop feeling grounded in shared reality and start feeling like you're standing on unstable ground, where facts move and clarity slips away. Betrayal thrives in this confusion because when truth becomes flexible, accountability quietly disappears with it. Increased secrecy. Increased secrecy is one of the most telling psychological shifts because it reflects an internal decision to separate worlds. Secrecy is not about privacy, it is about exclusion. When someone begins withholding information they once shared freely, it signals that parts of their life are being mentally reclassified as off-limits to you. This shift often happens gradually. Devices are turned face down. Conversations stop when you enter the room. Details are omitted, not because they are irrelevant, but because they belong to a version of themselves they no longer want you to access. Secrecy creates a private psychological space where actions can occur without immediate emotional consequence. What makes secrecy emotionally destabilizing is the instinctive alarm it triggers. Humans are deeply attuned to patterns of openness and closure in close relationships. When openness disappears without explanation, your nervous system registers it as a threat. You feel shut out, even if nothing concrete has been revealed. Secrecy also functions as emotional insulation. By keeping information hidden, the person avoids guilt, confrontation, and accountability. It allows them to maintain a surface version of the relationship while living a separate internal reality. This split becomes easier the more secrecy is normalized. Over time, increased secrecy shifts the balance of power. You are left guessing, sensing gaps, but lacking proof, while they control the flow of information. This uncertainty keeps you emotionally off balance, questioning what you know and what you're allowed to ask. Betrayal does not begin with action. It begins with concealment. Increased secrecy is the psychological rehearsal for disloyalty, where the mind learns to compartmentalize, justify, and protect hidden truths long before they ever come to light. Sudden emotional distance. Sudden emotional distance is one of the earliest and most unsettling psychological signals that betrayal may be forming beneath the surface. It rarely arrives loudly. Instead, it slips in quietly, disguised as stress, distraction, or exhaustion. Conversations that once flowed now feel forced. Emotional warmth is replaced with polite detachment. You sense the absence before you can explain it, and that confusion is what makes this signal so powerful. Humans are wired to maintain emotional proximity with those they are loyal to. When someone begins to pull away emotionally, it often reflects an internal shift, long before any external action occurs. Emotional distance creates space, and space creates permission. Permission to justify secrecy, to rationalize disloyal thoughts, and eventually to act without immediate guilt. This distancing is not just about silence, it's about withdrawal of presence. They stop sharing inner thoughts. They no longer seek comfort in you. Your emotional reactions feel like inconveniences rather than concerns. This creates an imbalance where you are still emotionally invested while they are already halfway gone. What makes this signal emotionally destabilizing is its ambiguity. There is no clear accusation to confront, no obvious proof to point to. Instead, you are left questioning your intuition, wondering if you are imagining things, overreacting, or asking for too much. That self-doubt erodes your emotional footing, making you more vulnerable and less likely to challenge what you feel. Sudden emotional distance is often the mind rehearsing separation before the body commits to betrayal. By the time words or actions confirm it, the emotional departure has already happened, leaving you trying to reconnect with someone who is no longer fully there. Guarding their phone or devices. Guarding their phone or personal devices is a modern psychological tell that often signals a hidden shift in loyalty. Devices are no longer just tools. They are extensions of private thought, secret communication, and alternate emotional worlds. When someone suddenly becomes protective over them, it suggests that those spaces now contain something that cannot be casually seen. This behavior often appears subtly at first. A phone flipped face down, a screen quickly locked when you enter the room, taking calls in another space, bringing their device everywhere, even to places where it was never needed before. These actions are not about privacy alone, but about control over information and perception. Psychologically, guarding a device reflects anticipatory fear. The mind is already rehearsing the possibility of discovery, so the body adapts by tightening access. Even without conscious intent, their nervous system reacts as if the device is a threat to their constructed reality. The more valuable the secret, the stronger the guarding behavior becomes. What makes this signal emotionally destabilizing is the exclusion it creates. You feel shut out of something that once felt shared or neutral. Trust begins to feel conditional. You may notice yourself hesitating before glancing in their direction, afraid of being seen as intrusive, even though the change did not originate with you. This behavior also rewires power dynamics. They control what is visible, what is hidden, and when reassurance is given. Over time, the device becomes a silent barrier between you, holding conversations, validations, or intentions that no longer include you. Guarding devices is rarely about the object itself. It is about protecting an inner world that has started to separate from the relationship, quietly preparing space for actions that require secrecy to survive. Reduced eye contact. Reduced eye contact is a quiet psychological fracture that often appears when someone is internally divided. Eye contact is one of the most primal forms of human connection. It signals honesty, presence, and emotional availability. When it begins to fade, it rarely does so without reason. At first, it may seem subtle, brief glances, distracted gazes, eyes drifting away during serious moments, but over time, the absence becomes noticeable, and more importantly, it becomes felt. The eyes are difficult to control when a person is hiding something. Maintaining eye contact requires a level of psychological congruence, a state where thoughts, emotions, and words are aligned. When betrayal is forming, that alignment fractures. The mind carries information the heart hasn't resolved, and the body instinctively seeks escape. Looking away becomes a form of emotional self-protection. This withdrawal of eye contact often coincides with internal guilt or cognitive dissonance. On some level, they know that sustained eye contact invites exposure. It invites questions. It invites truth. So they reduce it, not consciously, but instinctively, to avoid the emotional pressure that comes with being seen. What makes this signal emotionally triggering is the silent message it sends. When someone avoids your gaze, it can make you feel invisible, unworthy of attention, or emotionally unsafe. You may find yourself working harder to regain their focus, speaking more, explaining yourself, or softening your needs just to feel acknowledged again. Reduced eye contact creates an unspoken power shift. The person withdrawing holds the emotional leverage, while the one seeking connection feels destabilized. Over time, this erodes trust, not through lies, but through absence, an absence that speaks louder than words and leaves you sensing that something is being withheld just beyond your reach. Overly defensive responses. Overly defensive responses are a psychological reflex that often surfaces when someone feels internally threatened by truth. Defensiveness is not about the question being asked, but about what the question touches. When simple, reasonable inquiries are met with irritation, sarcasm, or exaggerated explanations, it signals that the person is protecting something fragile beneath the surface. At its core, defensiveness is a shield. It appears when a person anticipates exposure, even if no accusation has been made. The mind shifts into survival mode, interpreting curiosity as danger. As a result, responses become disproportionate to the situation. A neutral question feels like an attack. A calm concern is treated as an interrogation. This reaction often stems from cognitive dissonance, the psychological tension that arises when actions, thoughts, and self-image no longer align. To reduce that tension, the mind seeks to deflect responsibility outward. Instead of addressing the question, the focus shifts to your tone, your timing, or your intentions. The conversation stops being about the issue and becomes about your supposed wrongdoing for bringing it up. What makes overly defensive responses emotionally unsettling is how quickly they flip the roles. You begin as someone seeking clarity, but end up feeling guilty for asking. This creates confusion and self-doubt. You may start censoring yourself, walking on eggshells, or avoiding important conversations altogether just to preserve peace. Over time, defensiveness becomes a barrier to intimacy. It conditions you to associate honesty with conflict and curiosity with punishment. The more defensive they become, the less safe it feels to speak, and the more emotional distance grows. In this way, defensiveness doesn't just hide betrayal, it actively prepares the ground for it by silencing the very conversations that could expose it. Password changes without explanation. Password changes without explanation are a modern psychological red flag rooted in control over access. In close relationships, access is symbolic. It represents trust, transparency, and the absence of hidden compartments. When someone suddenly locks doors that were once open without a clear reason, it signals an internal shift long before it becomes an external one. This behavior is rarely about security alone. When passwords change quietly, it often reflects a desire to protect information from emotional exposure rather than from actual threat. The device becomes a psychological boundary, a private world they are actively separating from you. What once felt shared now feels restricted, and that restriction carries emotional weight. The mind justifies this shift through rationalization. They may tell themselves they deserve privacy, independence, or autonomy, but the timing is what matters. Sudden secrecy often follows new thoughts, new connections, or new behaviors that wouldn't survive openness. The password becomes a shield against questions they aren't ready to answer. What makes this signal emotionally destabilizing is the silence around it. There is no explanation offered, no reassurance given. You are left to notice the change on your own, which can trigger feelings of exclusion, mistrust, and quiet anxiety. It subtly tells you that there are parts of their life you are no longer allowed to see. Over time, unexplained password changes create a power imbalance. One person holds information, the other holds uncertainty, and uncertainty is fertile ground for doubt, intuition, and emotional unease to grow, often accurately, before the truth ever surfaces. Unusual schedule changes. Unusual schedule changes often signal that someone's life is being quietly rearranged to accommodate something they are not ready to reveal. Routines are psychological anchors. When a person is emotionally aligned and transparent, their schedule tends to follow predictable patterns. When betrayal begins forming, those patterns start to break, not all at once, but in subtle, seemingly reasonable ways. Meetings appear where none existed before. Work runs late without clear explanation. Plans become tentative instead of firm. The structure that once gave you a sense of reliability begins to dissolve. What makes this unsettling is that each change, on its own, can be justified. It's only when they accumulate that your intuition starts to react. Psychologically, altering a schedule creates both opportunity and distance. Opportunity to engage in behaviors or relationships that require privacy, and distance from the person who might notice the shift. The mind uses busyness as a socially acceptable cover because being occupied is rarely questioned. Over time, time itself becomes the shield. This signal is emotionally triggering because it disrupts your sense of access. You no longer know when you truly have their attention or when you are being fit in around something else. That uncertainty can make you feel unimportant or replaceable, even if nothing explicit has been said. Unusual schedule changes also weaken accountability. When routines disappear, expectations become unclear. You hesitate to ask questions because you don't want to seem controlling or suspicious. That hesitation creates silence, and silence creates room for secrecy to grow. By the time the schedule stabilizes again, it may already be organized around a reality you were never meant to see. Being vague about whereabouts. Being vague about whereabouts is a psychological signal that emerges when someone no longer wants their reality to be fully traceable. When trust is intact, location and plans are shared naturally, without effort or calculation. Vagueness, on the other hand, introduces blur where clarity once existed, and that blur is rarely accidental. This behavior often shows up as incomplete answers. They tell you they were out, busy, or with people, without offering names, places, or timelines. When asked follow-up questions, the details remain thin or slightly inconsistent, as if the story was designed to avoid specificity rather than communicate truth. The mind does this to preserve flexibility. The fewer details given, the fewer contradictions must be managed later. Emotionally, this creates unease. Your intuition senses the gap, even if logic tries to explain it away. Vagueness deprives you of grounding information, leaving your imagination to fill in the blanks. This can be more distressing than a clear answer, because uncertainty keeps the nervous system on alert. Vagueness also serves as a boundary testing mechanism. It quietly gauges how much opacity you will tolerate. If you don't press, the behavior continues. If you do, defensiveness or irritation often follows, conditioning you to stop asking. Over time, being vague about whereabouts normalizes distance. It shifts the relationship from shared awareness to selective disclosure. You are no longer part of the full picture, only the edited version they choose to present. Betrayal requires unobserved space. Vagueness creates that space psychologically first, allowing actions to occur without immediate emotional friction, while leaving you sensing that something important is happening just beyond your reach. Avoiding direct questions. Avoiding direct questions is a psychological maneuver that surfaces when truth feels unsafe to confront. Direct questions demand clarity, and clarity threatens hidden intentions. When someone begins to circle around answers instead of meeting them head-on, it often signals an internal conflict between what they know and what they are willing to reveal. This avoidance shows up as deflection rather than refusal. They change the subject, answer a different question than the one asked, respond with vague statements, or inject humor to dissolve the moment. On the surface, it feels like distraction. Beneath it, it is hesitation, an instinctive attempt to buy time and reduce exposure. Psychologically, direct questions activate accountability. They force the mind to choose between honesty and self-protection. When betrayal is forming, self-protection usually wins. The brain searches for escape routes that preserve plausibility while avoiding commitment to a specific truth. Ambiguity becomes a shield. What makes this signal emotionally unsettling is how it places the burden on you. You may feel compelled to soften your wording, rephrase your concern, or drop the subject entirely just to avoid tension. Over time, this trains you to silence your curiosity and doubt your right to clarity. Avoiding direct questions also erodes shared reality. Conversations lose their grounding, and important topics remain unresolved. The absence of clear answers creates a vacuum filled with assumptions, anxiety, and second-guessing. This behavior doesn't just hide information, it reshapes the relationship dynamic. When one person controls clarity and the other absorbs uncertainty, trust quietly weakens, and betrayal finds room to grow in the unanswered spaces left behind. Excessive justifications. Excessive justifications arise when someone feels the need to defend themselves before being accused. Instead of offering simple, natural explanations, they provide long, detailed rationales filled with unnecessary context. The explanation feels heavier than the situation requires, as if they are trying to convince not just you, but themselves. This behavior often signals internal guilt or anticipation of scrutiny. When a person is acting in alignment with their values, explanations come easily and briefly. When those values are being bent, the mind overcompensates. It adds layers, logic, and emotional framing in an attempt to make questionable behavior feel acceptable. The goal is not clarity, but closure, ending the conversation before it reaches uncomfortable territory. What makes excessive justifications emotionally unsettling is the pressure embedded within them. You may feel subtly manipulated into agreement, as though questioning their explanation would make you unreasonable or distrustful. The explanation leaves no space for follow-up, only acceptance. This can make you second-guess your instincts and hesitate to probe further. These justifications also serve as psychological insulation. By explaining too much, they blur the core issue. Important details get lost in the noise, and your focus shifts from what happened to how convincingly it was presented. Over time, this trains you to accept explanations at face value rather than examine their substance. Excessive justifications reveal a mind preparing for exposure. When words become overly elaborate, it's often because the truth alone no longer feels sufficient. The explanation becomes a performance designed to protect something fragile, hidden, and increasingly difficult to maintain. Unprompted alibis. Unprompted alibis appear when someone feels the need to defend themselves before being questioned. When a person is grounded in honesty, explanations are given when asked, not volunteered preemptively. Offering justifications without provocation is often a sign that the mind is already anticipating suspicion, even if none has been expressed. Psychologically, this happens when internal guilt or secrecy activates a state of vigilance. The person becomes hyper-aware of how their actions might be perceived. To reduce that internal tension, they provide explanations in advance, hoping to control the narrative before curiosity has a chance to arise. What makes this revealing is that the alibi arrives too early, as if it were rehearsed for a conversation that hasn't yet begun. These explanations often sound overly detailed or strangely specific. Instead of a simple statement, you receive a full backstory. This excess information is meant to appear transparent, but it often has the opposite effect. The more someone tries to prove they have nothing to hide, the more they signal that hiding is on their mind. Emotionally, unprompted alibis can create confusion and unease. You may feel pressured to accept the explanation, even though you never asked for one. Questioning it afterward can make you feel accusatory, as if you're moving the goalposts. This subtly discourages follow-up and protects the story from scrutiny. Over time, this behavior conditions you to ignore your instincts. You begin accepting explanations at face value, not because they feel true, but because challenging them feels uncomfortable. In this way, unprompted alibis don't just explain behavior. They preemptively disarm the very awareness that could uncover betrayal. Nervous laughter. Nervous laughter is a subtle emotional leak that occurs when the mind is trying to relieve internal pressure. Laughter is typically associated with joy, ease, or connection, but when it appears at inappropriate moments during serious conversations, tense questions, or emotionally charged situations, it becomes a signal of psychological discomfort rather than amusement. This type of laughter is often automatic. When someone feels exposed, uncertain, or internally conflicted, the nervous system searches for a release valve. Laughter interrupts the emotional intensity of the moment, diffusing tension without addressing its source. It acts as a distraction, both for them and for you, pulling attention away from what is actually being discussed. What makes nervous laughter emotionally unsettling is the mismatch it creates. You may be sharing concern, confusion, or vulnerability while they respond with a smile or a laugh that feels out of place. This incongruence creates emotional dissonance, making you question whether your feelings are being taken seriously. Over time, this can feel invalidating, as though your emotional reality is being minimized. Nervous laughter also functions as a protective shield. It softens moments where honesty might be required, allowing the person to avoid direct engagement without outright refusal. By laughing, they delay confrontation and reduce the perceived severity of the situation. As this pattern repeats, important conversations lose depth. Serious moments are deflected, clarity is postponed, and emotional accountability fades. Nervous laughter becomes a way to stay emotionally uncommitted, keeping things light on the surface while tension quietly accumulates underneath, creating fertile ground for misunderstanding, distance, and eventually betrayal. Overcompensating with kindness. Overcompensating with kindness is one of the most confusing psychological signals because it wears the mask of care while hiding internal conflict. On the surface, everything seems positive. They are suddenly more attentive, more generous, more affectionate. Compliments increase. Favors appear unprompted. Yet beneath this warmth is often a quiet imbalance that feels strangely out of place. This behavior is commonly driven by unresolved guilt. When someone's actions or intentions begin to drift away from loyalty, the mind looks for ways to restore emotional equilibrium without confronting the root cause. Kindness becomes a form of emotional payment, an unconscious attempt to offset internal wrongdoing without having to admit it. What makes this signal emotionally disorienting is the contradiction it creates. You feel appreciated, yet uneasy. The affection doesn't feel earned through connection, but delivered through effort. Instead of deepening intimacy, it creates a subtle sense of performance, as though the kindness is compensating for something missing rather than flowing naturally from closeness. Psychologically, overcompensating kindness serves two purposes. It quiets their own guilt and it lowers your suspicion. When warmth increases suddenly, it can make you question your intuition. You may dismiss concerns because the behavior appears loving, even when your emotional instincts sense misalignment. Over time, this pattern can distort trust. You may begin to associate affection with inconsistency, never knowing whether kindness reflects genuine care or internal damage control. The most unsettling aspect is that betrayal doesn't always arrive with coldness. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in softness, using kindness not to connect, but to conceal the growing distance between intent and truth. Sudden guilt-driven generosity. Sudden guilt-driven generosity appears when internal remorse looks for an external release. It often arrives without warning: unexpected gifts, excessive kindness, unprompted favors, or a noticeable increase in attentiveness that feels out of sync with recent emotional behavior. On the surface, it looks like care. Beneath it, however, is often an attempt to soothe guilt rather than express genuine connection. When someone feels they have crossed or are preparing to cross a personal boundary, the mind seeks balance. This is rooted in moral accounting, the psychological need to offset perceived wrongdoing with positive actions. Generosity becomes a way to feel like a good person again without addressing the source of the guilt itself. What makes this signal emotionally confusing is its contradiction. You may sense emotional distance or secrecy, yet suddenly receive affection or material gestures. This creates cognitive dissonance in you. Your intuition senses something is wrong, but the generosity pressures you to ignore that feeling. After all, someone who is being kind couldn't be hiding something. At least that's what the mind is nudged to believe. This form of giving is often excessive or poorly timed. It doesn't respond to your emotional needs, it overrides them. Instead of repairing connection, it attempts to bypass it. The gesture replaces conversation. The gift replaces accountability. Over time, guilt-driven generosity can train you to associate discomfort with reward. You learn to accept emotional inconsistency as long as it's softened by kindness. Meanwhile, the underlying issue remains untouched, growing quietly beneath the surface, where generosity cannot reach, but guilt continues to accumulate. Loss of empathy. Loss of empathy is one of the most emotionally devastating signals of approaching betrayal because it strikes at the core of human connection. Empathy is the ability to feel with someone, not just understand them. When it fades, the relationship begins to feel cold, transactional, and unsafe, even if everything looks normal on the surface. This shift often happens gradually. They stop responding to your emotions with curiosity or care. Your stress is met with indifference. Your pain feels inconvenient. Where there was once reassurance, there is now silence or impatience. Psychologically, this loss of empathy occurs when someone begins to emotionally detach in order to justify future harm. It is easier to betray someone you no longer emotionally register as fully human in your inner world. The mind does this to reduce guilt. Empathy creates accountability. When you feel another person's emotions, harming them creates internal conflict. By shutting empathy down, the person creates emotional distance that makes disloyal thoughts and actions easier to tolerate. This emotional numbing is not accidental. It is a protective mechanism for their own conscience. What makes this signal deeply triggering is how invisible it can be at first. You may sense that something is wrong, but struggle to explain it. You might start feeling lonely even when you're together. Your emotional needs begin to feel excessive, even though they haven't changed. Loss of empathy shifts the emotional balance of power. You remain open and vulnerable, while they become insulated and detached. Over time, this imbalance erodes trust and safety. When someone can no longer feel with you, they can justify almost anything against you because your emotional reality no longer registers as something that matters. Dismissive tone toward your concerns. A dismissive tone toward your concerns is a psychological signal that reveals emotional disengagement in real time. Tone carries more truth than words, and when your worries are met with sighs, sarcasm, indifference, or subtle irritation, it signals that your emotional experience is no longer being prioritized. What you feel is treated as an inconvenience rather than something worthy of care. This dismissal often appears when someone is internally conflicted or emotionally detached. Acknowledging your concerns would require empathy, presence, and accountability. When those are in short supply, the mind looks for shortcuts. Minimizing, brushing off, or belittling what you express becomes an efficient way to avoid deeper engagement. Emotionally, this is deeply destabilizing. You may start questioning the legitimacy of your own feelings, wondering if you are too sensitive, dramatic, or demanding. This self-doubt is not accidental. A dismissive tone subtly shifts the emotional burden onto you, training you to suppress concerns to maintain harmony. Over time, this creates an unsafe emotional environment. You stop sharing openly, not because the issues disappear, but because speaking up feels pointless or risky. The relationship becomes quieter, but not healthier. Unspoken resentment replaces dialogue. Dismissiveness also erodes mutual respect. When one person's emotional reality is consistently minimized, the bond weakens. Emotional intimacy requires validation, not agreement, and when validation disappears, connection follows. Betrayal thrives where concerns are ignored. When your feelings are treated as obstacles rather than signals, it becomes easier for someone to justify secrecy, rationalize harmful choices, and detach further, all while you are left carrying emotions that no longer have a place to land. Frequent irritability. Frequent irritability is a psychological pressure leak that often appears when someone is carrying unresolved internal tension. When a person's thoughts, intentions, or actions are misaligned with their values, that tension looks for an outlet. Irritability becomes one of the easiest ways for the mind to release pressure without revealing its source. This irritation is rarely proportional to the situation. Small inconveniences trigger sharp reactions. Neutral comments are met with impatience. Ordinary interactions feel charged, as though you are constantly on the verge of saying the wrong thing. What's happening beneath the surface is not anger toward you, but frustration with themselves and the situation they are internally managing. Psychologically, this occurs because deception and divided loyalty consume cognitive and emotional resources. The brain is multitasking, maintaining appearances, suppressing guilt, and managing fear of exposure. That mental load lowers emotional tolerance. The nervous system becomes hypersensitive, making minor stimuli feel overwhelming. What makes frequent irritability emotionally triggering is the instability it creates. You begin adjusting your behavior to avoid setting them off. You monitor your tone, your words, your timing. This self-monitoring slowly shifts the emotional balance, placing responsibility for their mood onto you. Over time, irritability erodes safety. Conversations feel like potential conflicts rather than opportunities for connection. Instead of curiosity, there is tension. Instead of ease, there is restraint. This emotional volatility creates distance not through absence, but through discomfort. Frequent irritability often precedes emotional withdrawal or betrayal because it externalizes inner chaos. Rather than confronting what they are avoiding, the discomfort spills outward, subtly pushing you away and making emotional separation feel justified rather than chosen. Uncharacteristic impatience. Uncharacteristic impatience surfaces when someone's inner world is overloaded and leaking outward. It shows up as irritation over small things, sharp responses where patience once existed, and a shortened emotional fuse that seems to appear without clear cause. What makes it notable is not the impatience itself, but how out of alignment it feels with who they used to be. When a person is carrying hidden thoughts, secrets, or divided loyalties, their cognitive load increases. The mind is constantly managing what to say, what to hide, and how to maintain a consistent image. This mental strain reduces tolerance. Small delays feel heavier. Minor questions feel intrusive. Normal interactions feel like obstacles rather than connections. This impatience is often displaced. The frustration isn't truly about you or the situation in front of them, but about the pressure of sustaining an internal conflict. Because they cannot express the real source, it spills out sideways, attaching itself to trivial moments. You become the nearest outlet for tension you didn't create. What makes this signal emotionally triggering is the sudden shift in safety. Where you once felt understood, you now feel like a burden. You may start editing yourself, rushing your words, or suppressing needs to avoid provoking irritation. This slowly teaches you that your presence is inconvenient. Over time, uncharacteristic impatience erodes emotional closeness. It replaces curiosity with annoyance and compassion with urgency. The more impatient they become, the less space there is for honesty and the less room there is for connection to survive without feeling like a liability rather than a bond. Shifting blame onto you. Shifting blame onto you is a psychological maneuver that often emerges when someone is trying to escape internal accountability. Instead of facing their own actions, emotions, or intentions, the mind looks for an external target to carry the weight of responsibility. When betrayal is forming, blame becomes a convenient place to hide. This shift rarely happens all at once. At first, it appears subtle. You are told that your reactions are the real problem, not their behavior. Your questions become accusations in their narrative. Your needs are reframed as demands. Psychologically, this allows them to maintain a positive self-image while distancing themselves from guilt. If you are at fault, then they are justified. What makes this signal emotionally destabilizing is how it distorts reality. You begin the conversation seeking understanding, but end it apologizing. Over time, you start examining yourself more than their actions. This erosion of self-trust makes it easier for them to continue crossing boundaries without resistance. Blame shifting also creates a power imbalance. The person assigning blame controls the emotional direction of the relationship. They decide what is acceptable, what is excessive, and what deserves attention. Your role slowly shifts from partner to defendant, constantly explaining, defending, and correcting yourself. On a deeper level, this behavior reduces empathy and increases entitlement. By placing responsibility on you, they emotionally separate themselves from the consequences of their choices. This makes betrayal feel less like a violation and more like a response to circumstances you supposedly created. As this pattern continues, your emotional energy is spent trying to fix yourself instead of recognizing what is actually happening. Blame becomes the smoke that obscures their actions, keeping you focused inward while the real rupture grows quietly beneath the surface. Gaslighting behaviors. Gaslighting behaviors are a psychological distortion that slowly erodes your trust in your own perception of reality. Rather than directly denying events, gaslighting works by subtly rewriting them. Conversations are reframed, emotions are invalidated, and facts are questioned just enough to make you doubt yourself without realizing how it happened. This behavior often appears when someone needs to protect a hidden truth. Instead of addressing inconsistencies or concerns, they challenge your memory, your interpretation, or your emotional response. You are told you're overreacting, imagining things, or remembering it wrong. Over time, this creates confusion. Not because reality is unclear, but because it is being deliberately blurred. What makes gaslighting emotionally devastating is its cumulative effect. One instance may feel harmless or easily dismissed, but repetition wears down your confidence. You begin relying on their version of events over your own instincts. This internal displacement of trust leaves you emotionally disoriented and dependent. Gaslighting also shifts power. When your perception becomes unreliable in your own mind, the person controlling the narrative gains psychological leverage. They no longer need to hide the truth carefully. They only need to question your ability to recognize it. Emotionally, this creates isolation. You may hesitate to speak to others, fearing you'll sound unreasonable or confused. You turn inward, analyzing yourself instead of the behavior that triggered concern in the first place. Betrayal flourishes in this fog. Gaslighting doesn't just conceal wrongdoing, it conditions you to stop searching for clarity at all, leaving you trapped in a reality shaped by someone else's version of the truth. Minimizing shared history. Minimizing shared history is a psychological detachment process that often occurs when someone is preparing to emotionally exit without fully acknowledging it. Shared memories carry weight. They create obligation, empathy, and continuity. When a person begins to downplay or rewrite that history, it signals an attempt to loosen the emotional ties that once anchored them. This shows up in subtle language shifts. Moments that once mattered are referred to casually or dismissively. Achievements, struggles, and milestones you face together are framed as insignificant, exaggerated, or not that serious. The emotional meaning is stripped away, leaving the past feeling distant and replaceable. Psychologically, this behavior serves to reduce guilt. Betrayal is harder to justify when the bond feels deep and meaningful. By minimizing shared history, the mind reframes the relationship as less significant, making disloyal thoughts or actions feel more permissible. If the past didn't matter that much, then neither does the damage caused to it. What makes this signal emotionally destabilizing is the sense of erasure it creates. You may feel as though parts of your life are being invalidated, as if experiences that shaped you both are being quietly deleted. This can lead to confusion, grief, and a need to defend memories that once felt unquestionable. Minimizing shared history also shifts power. They position themselves as less invested, less attached, more independent. Meanwhile, you are left holding the emotional weight of a past that suddenly feels one-sided. This detachment doesn't happen by accident. It is a psychological preparation, a way of emotionally stepping away while still physically present, making eventual betrayal feel less like a rupture and more like a continuation of distance already created. Devaluing the relationship. Devaluing the relationship is a psychological shift that often occurs when someone is preparing to justify emotional or moral distance. It begins subtly through dismissive comments, minimized memories, or a quiet rewriting of what the relationship means. What was once important becomes framed as ordinary, burdensome, or no longer special. This change is rarely announced. It reveals itself through tone, language, and attitude. When betrayal starts forming internally, the mind looks for ways to reduce guilt. One of the most effective ways to do this is to lower the perceived value of what might be betrayed. By convincing themselves that the relationship isn't as meaningful, fulfilling, or unique as it once was, they create psychological permission to detach without fully confronting the harm. This devaluation often shows up as comparison. They may highlight flaws that never seemed to matter before or imply that the connection has always been lacking. Shared struggles are reframed as proof the relationship was weak rather than evidence of resilience. This narrative shift allows them to see themselves not as someone causing pain, but as someone escaping something already broken. What makes this signal emotionally painful is how invisible it can feel at first. You sense a loss of appreciation, a lack of pride, a missing warmth, but there is no single moment to point to. Instead, you feel slowly reduced, as though the bond you believed in is being quietly downgraded without your consent. Over time, devaluing the relationship drains emotional investment. It transforms closeness into obligation and loyalty into inconvenience, leaving you holding on to something that is being internally dismantled by the person you trust. Increased criticism of you. Increased criticism of you often appears when someone is psychologically preparing to justify emotional or moral separation. Criticism is not just about pointing out flaws. It is a way of reshaping perception. When betrayal begins to form, the mind looks for reasons to reduce guilt, and one of the most effective ways to do that is by reframing you as inadequate. This shift usually starts subtly. Comments that were once supportive become sharp. Small mistakes are magnified. Your traits are no longer quirks, but problems. Psychologically, this serves a purpose. By focusing on your perceived shortcomings, they create a narrative where their dissatisfaction feels logical rather than disloyal. What makes this signal emotionally triggering is how personal it feels. You may notice yourself trying harder, adjusting your behavior, or seeking reassurance that no longer comes. The criticism creates insecurity, and insecurity creates compliance. You become more focused on fixing yourself than questioning why the tone has changed. Increased criticism also functions as emotional distancing. Each negative comment chips away at intimacy, replacing connection with judgment. Over time, warmth is replaced by evaluation. Instead of feeling chosen, you feel tolerated. This behavior often coexists with idealization of others. While you are criticized, someone else is admired, even if only in subtle ways. This contrast further destabilizes you, making you feel replaceable. On a deeper level, constant criticism dehumanizes. It turns a partner into a problem to be managed rather than a person to be cared for. Once someone convinces themselves that you are the source of their discomfort, betraying you no longer feels like a violation. It feels like relief, idealizing someone else. Idealizing someone else is a psychological signal that often reveals emotional displacement before any overt betrayal occurs. When admiration shifts outward in an exaggerated or persistent way, it reflects an internal comparison that has already begun. This is not casual appreciation, it is elevation. The other person is framed as inspiring, understanding, exciting, or exceptional, often in ways that feel pointed rather than neutral. This idealization serves a mental function. By placing someone else on a pedestal, the person creates emotional distance from you without directly confronting dissatisfaction or guilt. The more ideal the other becomes, the more the current relationship is silently devalued. This contrast allows betrayal to feel justified rather than disruptive. Emotionally, this is deeply unsettling. You may notice subtle comparisons, stories that highlight the other person's qualities, or a tone that carries admiration where intimacy used to exist. Even when unspoken, the shift is felt. It creates a quiet sense of replacement, as though your emotional position is being renegotiated without your consent. Idealization also distorts reality. No one is as flawless as they are portrayed in these moments. The exaggeration reveals fantasy more than truth. It is the mind escaping into a narrative that feels easier, cleaner, or more validating than the complexity of a real relationship. Over time, this admiration redirects emotional energy. Attention, curiosity, and emotional responsiveness flow outward instead of inward. The bond weakens not through conflict, but through neglect. Betrayal often begins with fantasy. Idealizing someone else is the rehearsal, where loyalty erodes internally while actions still appear intact, leaving you sensing that their emotional loyalty has already started to drift elsewhere. Comparing you negatively to others. Comparing you negatively to others is a psychological distancing tactic that often emerges when someone is mentally shifting their loyalty elsewhere. Comparison is not neutral. It reshapes perception, rewrites value, and quietly reframes the relationship narrative. When someone begins highlighting how others are more understanding, more exciting, more successful, or more emotionally appealing than you, it signals an internal reorientation away from appreciation and toward justification. This behavior allows the mind to create contrast. By elevating others and diminishing you, they reduce the emotional dissonance associated with betrayal. If someone else appears better suited, then disloyal thoughts or actions begin to feel less like a violation and more like a natural progression. The comparison becomes a rationalization disguised as honesty. What makes this signal deeply emotionally triggering is the way it destabilizes self-worth. You may find yourself internalizing the comparison, questioning your adequacy, and trying to compete with invisible standards that constantly shift. Instead of feeling chosen, you feel evaluated. Instead of feeling secure, you feel replaceable. Psychologically, negative comparison also externalizes responsibility. Rather than confronting their own dissatisfaction or restlessness, they project it onto perceived flaws in you. This reframing allows them to avoid accountability while slowly rewriting the story of why the bond is weakening. Over time, these comparisons erode emotional safety. Affection becomes conditional, contingent on performance rather than connection. You may feel pressure to change, improve, or prove yourself just to maintain standing. Comparing you negatively to others is rarely about growth. It is often about creating emotional distance while constructing a narrative where drifting away feels justified inevitable, and no longer cruel. Reduced affection. Reduced affection is often one of the most emotionally disorienting signals because it attacks connection at its most human level. Affection is not just touch or words, it is reassurance, presence, and emotional safety. When it begins to fade without explanation, the absence speaks louder than any argument ever could. This shift usually isn't sudden withdrawal, but gradual erosion. Hugs become shorter, compliments disappear, physical closeness feels obligatory rather than instinctive. What once flowed naturally now feels rationed. This happens when emotional energy is being redirected elsewhere, or when someone is psychologically distancing themselves to reduce internal conflict. Affection requires emotional availability. When a person is entertaining betrayal, whether emotional or behavioral, they often unconsciously reduce affection to create emotional space. That distance makes disloyal thoughts easier to justify and harder to confront. The body follows the mind, pulling away before the truth ever surfaces. What makes reduced affection deeply triggering is how it activates insecurity and longing simultaneously. You may find yourself craving reassurance, replaying moments, or trying harder to earn warmth that used to be freely given. This imbalance creates vulnerability, placing you in a position of pursuit while they occupy the role of withdrawal. Over time, reduced affection rewires the emotional dynamic. You begin associating closeness with uncertainty and love with effort. The relationship starts to feel fragile, conditional, and emotionally unsafe, not because of something you did, but because affection is no longer being used to connect, only to maintain appearances, while something deeper quietly disconnects. Mechanical or forced affection. Mechanical or forced affection is one of the most confusing signals because it imitates closeness while lacking emotional truth. On the surface, the gestures are still there. The hugs happen. The words are spoken. The routines remain. But something essential is missing. The affection feels rehearsed rather than felt, as if it's being performed to meet an expectation rather than offered from genuine desire. Psychologically, this occurs when emotional investment has declined but obligation remains. The person knows what they are supposed to do to appear connected, so they go through the motions without emotional presence. This allows them to maintain a familiar image while internally distancing themselves. Affection becomes a role, not a reflection of feeling. What makes this signal emotionally triggering is the dissonance it creates. Your mind registers the behavior, but your body senses the absence. The warmth doesn't linger. The touch doesn't reassure. You may feel strangely lonely in moments that are supposed to feel intimate. And that loneliness is deeply unsettling because it contradicts what you are seeing. Forced affection also serves as a psychological buffer against suspicion. It creates just enough closeness to delay questions. If affection exists, even mechanically, it becomes harder to justify doubt. This keeps you anchored to hope rather than clarity. Over time, this pattern erodes emotional safety. You may start questioning your own sensitivity, wondering if you're expecting too much. But forced affection is not about effort. It's about emotional withdrawal. When intimacy becomes mechanical, it signals that their heart has already stepped back, even if their actions haven't fully followed yet. Avoiding future planning. Avoiding future planning is a psychological signal that reveals emotional uncertainty long before it is spoken aloud. When someone is invested and aligned, the future is naturally included in conversation. Plans, goals, and shared visions emerge effortlessly because the mind assumes continuity. When that assumption breaks, the future becomes uncomfortable territory. This avoidance often shows up subtly. Conversations that once included we shift into I. Plans are kept short-term, vague, or perpetually postponed. When you bring up future events, milestones, or commitments, the response feels evasive, non-committal, or dismissive. It's not that they can't plan. It's that planning requires emotional presence they may no longer feel. Emotionally, this creates instability. The future provides psychological safety. It reassures you that what you're building has direction. When that reassurance disappears, you're left anchored only in the present, unsure whether your emotional investment has a destination or an expiration date. Avoiding future planning also reduces accountability. The fewer promises made, the fewer obligations exist. This mental flexibility makes it easier to justify emotional withdrawal or conflicting choices later. The person keeps their options open, even if you are still committing inwardly. What makes this signal particularly painful is its silence. There is no argument, no clear rejection, just absence. You begin questioning whether it's the right time, whether you're asking for too much, or whether the future simply shouldn't be discussed yet. Betrayal rarely starts with leaving. It starts with imagining a future that no longer includes you, and avoiding future planning is the quiet behavior that reveals that internal separation is already underway. Canceling commitments. Canceling commitments often is a behavioral signal that reflects shifting priorities long before it is openly acknowledged. Commitments are expressions of value. When someone repeatedly breaks them, it suggests that their internal hierarchy has changed, even if they struggle to admit it aloud. Time, attention, and follow-through begin flowing elsewhere. At first, the cancellations come with reasonable explanations: stress, exhaustion, unexpected obligations. Each excuse sounds plausible on its own. But over time, a pattern forms. Plans are postponed, rescheduled, or forgotten entirely. What was once protected time becomes flexible, then optional, then disposable. Psychologically, this behavior reduces emotional friction. Showing up requires presence, consistency, and engagement. When someone is emotionally conflicted or drifting toward betrayal, fulfilling commitments feels burdensome. Avoidance becomes easier than confronting the growing disconnect. Canceling buys distance without requiring honesty. What makes this signal emotionally triggering is the uncertainty it creates. You are left waiting, adjusting, holding space that may or may not be filled. Anticipation turns into disappointment, and disappointment quietly reshapes trust. You may begin lowering expectations, preparing for absence before it happens. Repeated cancellations also communicate a subtle message of replaceability. Your time is treated as adjustable, while theirs remains protected. This imbalance slowly erodes mutual respect and shared stability. Over time, the relationship begins to exist more in intention than in action. Promises remain verbal, but consistency fades. Canceling commitments often is not just about scheduling conflicts. It is about emotional withdrawal expressed through behavior, signaling that the bond is no longer being actively chosen, even if it has not yet been openly abandoned. Emotional unavailability. Emotional unavailability is the silent withdrawal of presence, even when someone is physically still there. Conversations become surface level, feelings are deflected, and vulnerability is met with avoidance rather than care. You may still talk, still coexist, but the emotional access you once had feels locked behind an invisible barrier. This shift often occurs when someone is internally divided. To engage emotionally requires honesty, consistency, and emotional risk. When betrayal is forming, emotional engagement becomes dangerous because it threatens to expose inner conflict. Detachment becomes a form of self-protection. By staying emotionally unavailable, they avoid confronting both your feelings and their own. What makes this signal especially destabilizing is how subtle it is. There is no obvious fight, no clear rejection. Instead, emotional bids are ignored, minimized, or met with logic instead of empathy. You may open up only to feel like your emotions land in empty space. Over time, this creates loneliness inside the relationship itself. Emotional unavailability also preserves psychological distance. It allows them to maintain control while avoiding accountability. If they don't engage emotionally, they don't have to explain themselves, reassure you, or confront the consequences of their internal shift. The emotional impact on you is profound. You may begin doubting your needs, lowering expectations, or blaming yourself for wanting more. The absence of emotional reciprocity trains you to survive on fragments of connection, while they slowly detach internally. Betrayal doesn't begin with action. It begins when emotional access is quietly revoked and replaced with distance that feels permanent but is never acknowledged. Detached body language. Detached body language is the physical manifestation of emotional withdrawal. Long before words change, the body reveals where the mind has gone. When someone is emotionally present, their posture leans in, their movements are responsive, and their body naturally orients toward connection. When betrayal begins to take shape internally, that alignment quietly breaks. This detachment shows up in subtle ways. They sit farther away, their torso turns slightly from you, touch becomes brief or absent, their body feels closed, guarded, or rigid, even in moments that once felt relaxed. Psychologically, the body pulls back to match the emotional distance the person is creating inside. It is easier to disconnect emotionally when the body stops participating in closeness. What makes this signal emotionally triggering is how instinctive it feels. You may sense rejection without a single word being spoken. The lack of physical openness can make you feel unwanted, unseen, or emotionally unsafe, even if they insist that nothing is wrong. This disconnect between words and body creates confusion and self-doubt. Detached body language also reduces vulnerability. By physically withdrawing, they protect themselves from emotional engagement and accountability. The body becomes a barrier, limiting intimacy and making deeper connection harder to access. Over time, this physical distancing conditions you to lower your expectations. You stop reaching out. You stop initiating touch. The relationship begins to feel colder, more transactional, and less alive. When the body is no longer aligned with connection, it signals that emotional loyalty is weakening, creating space where betrayal can exist without immediate resistance. Turning conflicts into distractions. Turning conflicts into distractions is a psychological maneuver that redirects attention away from emotional accountability. When meaningful issues arise, they require presence, honesty, and vulnerability. If someone is internally conflicted or protecting something hidden, direct confrontation feels threatening. Distraction becomes the escape. This often appears when serious conversations are derailed by humor, sudden topic changes, exaggerated reactions, or unrelated problems introduced at just the right moment. The original issue never reaches resolution because the emotional focus is constantly shifted. What should be addressed becomes buried under noise. Emotionally, this is disorienting. You enter a conversation seeking clarity, but leave feeling scattered, unsure how the discussion ended up somewhere else entirely. Over time, this conditions you to associate conflict with confusion rather than resolution. You may stop pressing issues, not because they no longer matter, but because they never seem to go anywhere. Distraction also serves as emotional avoidance. By refusing to stay with discomfort, the person avoids confronting their own role, guilt, or responsibility. This keeps the surface calm while unresolved tension accumulates beneath it. The relationship appears functional, but only because nothing is ever fully examined. What makes this behavior emotionally triggering is the erosion of emotional safety. When conflicts can't be held and explored, intimacy suffers. You begin feeling unheard, not in volume, but in substance. Betrayal thrives where conflicts are never resolved. Turning conflicts into distractions prevents clarity, delays truth, and creates space for hidden behaviors to continue unchallenged, all while giving the illusion that nothing is seriously wrong. Refusing accountability. Refusing accountability is a psychological defense that surfaces when someone is no longer willing to face the consequences of their inner choices. Accountability requires ownership, and ownership threatens the fragile structure holding denial together. When betrayal is forming, admitting fault becomes too dangerous because it forces alignment between intention, action, and self-image. This refusal often appears as deflection rather than denial. Mistakes are minimized, circumstances are blamed, or responsibility is redirected toward you or external factors. Even when evidence is clear, the conversation shifts away from impact and toward justification. The focus is not on repair, but on escape. Psychologically, refusing accountability protects the ego. Accepting responsibility would require confronting guilt, shame, or the realization that they are acting against their own values. To avoid that discomfort, the mind chooses distance over honesty. Accountability becomes framed as accusation, and repair becomes framed as control. What makes this signal emotionally destabilizing is how it reverses the emotional burden. You may find yourself explaining why harm occurred, proving that your feelings are valid, or negotiating for basic acknowledgement. Over time, this drains emotional energy and creates a sense of futility. Refusing accountability also erodes trust at its foundation. Without ownership, there is no repair. Without repair, there is no safety. Each unresolved issue compounds, creating emotional debt that is never repaid. This behavior often precedes betrayal because it removes the last barrier to wrongdoing. When a person no longer sees themselves as responsible for the impact of their actions, loyalty becomes optional and harm becomes something that can always be explained away rather than confronted. Sudden independence narrative. Sudden independence narrative emerges when someone begins reframing distance as growth. They start emphasizing autonomy, personal freedom, and self-focus in ways that feel abrupt and out of character. Independence becomes a theme, repeated often enough that it feels less like a value and more like a justification. This shift usually appears when emotional or moral separation is already underway internally. By redefining themselves as someone who needs space, less attachment, or fewer obligations, they create a story that makes withdrawal seem healthy rather than harmful. The narrative isn't about independence itself, but about permission to detach without guilt. What makes this signal emotionally unsettling is how reasonable it sounds. Growth, boundaries, and self-discovery are valid concepts, which makes it difficult to challenge the timing or intention behind them. You may feel selfish or controlling for questioning it even when your intuition senses something is off. This narrative often minimizes shared identity. The language shifts from we to I. Joint decisions become personal choices. Emotional interdependence is reframed as weakness or limitation. This subtly erodes the foundation of mutual responsibility while maintaining a moral high ground. Over time, the sudden independence narrative isolates you emotionally. You are left adapting to new rules you didn't agree to, while being told it's for the best. The story positions them as evolving and you as something they are growing away from. In this space, betrayal feels less like a rupture and more like a natural next step they've already explained to themselves. Rewriting past events. Rewriting past events is a psychological defense that emerges when someone needs the past to stop contradicting their present intentions. Memory is not just about recall, it is about meaning. When betrayal begins forming, the original meaning of shared experiences becomes inconvenient. To relieve that tension, the mind subtly reshapes history. This rewriting often starts quietly. Moments that were once described as loving are now framed as suffocating. Conflicts that were resolved resurface as proof of long-standing unhappiness. Your recollection of events is challenged, not aggressively, but with calm certainty. The goal is not necessarily to convince you immediately, but to destabilize your confidence in what you remember. Psychologically, this allows them to construct a narrative where betrayal feels justified rather than abrupt. If the past was never good, then leaving or crossing boundaries feels less like a rupture and more like a correction. By altering the story, they reduce guilt and increase emotional permission to act against you. What makes this signal deeply unsettling is how it attacks shared reality. You may find yourself defending memories you once felt secure in. This creates confusion and emotional exhaustion. When the past becomes negotiable, the present feels unsafe. Rewriting past events also isolates you. Shared history is one of the strongest bonds between people. When that history is invalidated, the bond weakens. You may feel as though the foundation of the relationship is being quietly dismantled while you are still standing on it. As this pattern continues, truth becomes flexible and accountability fades. If the past can be rewritten, then responsibility can always be deferred. Betrayal thrives in this altered reality because once history is unstable, loyalty no longer feels anchored to anything real. Contradicting themselves unknowingly is a psychological signal that emerges when someone is no longer anchored to a single internal truth. When honesty is intact, the mind operates from one consistent narrative. When deception, omission, or emotional conflict enters, that narrative fragments and contradictions begin to surface without conscious intent. These contradictions are often subtle. A statement made casually one day quietly conflicts with something said earlier. Opinions shift without acknowledgement. Details change just enough to feel off, but not enough to be immediately challenged. This happens because the brain is juggling multiple versions of reality, and maintaining perfect consistency requires cognitive effort that eventually slips. What makes this signal emotionally unsettling is how it destabilizes your sense of certainty. You may notice the contradiction, but hesitate to point it out, unsure whether it matters or whether you remembered correctly. This hesitation creates internal tension, pulling your attention inward instead of outward toward the behavior itself. Unknowingly contradicting oneself also reveals divided loyalty. When someone is emotionally invested in more than one narrative, their words begin to leak the conflict. They are not lying with precision. They are adapting moment by moment, responding to what feels safest in the present rather than what is true. Emotionally, this erodes trust through confusion rather than confrontation. You begin feeling like conversations lack solid ground, as though reality subtly shifts depending on timing or context. Betrayal does not require constant lying. It only requires enough internal division that truth becomes unstable. These unconscious contradictions are the mind revealing that alignment has already been compromised, long before actions make it undeniable. Increased lying about small things. Increased lying about small things is one of the clearest psychological indicators that truth is losing its stability. Small lies are rarely about necessity. They are about testing boundaries, reducing internal resistance, and rehearsing deception on a scale that feels manageable. When someone begins lying where honesty would cost them nothing, it signals a deeper shift in integrity. These lies often seem trivial. Minor details, harmless explanations, unnecessary alterations of facts. Because the stakes appear low, they are easy to dismiss. Yet, psychologically, small lies serve a critical function. They desensitize the mind to dishonesty. Each lie weakens the emotional discomfort associated with deception, making larger lies feel less foreign when the moment arrives. What makes this signal emotionally unsettling is how it destabilizes your sense of reality. You may catch inconsistencies, but hesitate to challenge them because the issue feels too small to justify confrontation. Over time, this teaches you to ignore your intuition and accept explanations that don't fully sit right. Psychologically, lying about small things also reflects a need for control. Truth becomes something to manage rather than share. They choose what version of reality you receive, even when accuracy would change nothing. This control creates emotional distance and subtly shifts power in the relationship. As these small lies accumulate, trust erodes quietly. The relationship no longer rests on shared truth, but on selective disclosure. Betrayal rarely begins with major deception. It begins with minor dishonesty that trains both the liar and the listener to tolerate a reality where truth is optional and accountability can always be postponed. Loss of transparency. Loss of transparency occurs when openness quietly disappears without being replaced by honesty or explanation. Information that was once shared freely now arrives late, partially, or only when pressed. You begin to notice gaps, not because you are searching, but because the flow of truth no longer feels natural. Transparency is not about total disclosure. It is about consistency and willingness. When someone is aligned with trust, they offer clarity without resistance. When that alignment breaks, transparency becomes selective. Details are filtered. Context is withheld. Conversations feel edited rather than open. This shift often reflects internal compartmentalization. When parts of someone's life no longer fit the image they want you to see, they start managing what you're allowed to know. The goal isn't necessarily to lie, but to control perception. Silence becomes safer than truth, and omission becomes the preferred tool. What makes loss of transparency emotionally destabilizing is the way it sharpens intuition. You sense that something is missing, yet nothing concrete is said. This ambiguity creates anxiety, self-doubt, and a constant low-level vigilance. You may find yourself connecting dots you wish you didn't have to notice. Over time, transparency loss erodes relational safety. Trust weakens not because of what is revealed, but because of what is avoided. You stop feeling like a participant in their life and start feeling like an observer with limited access. In that space, emotional distance deepens, and betrayal becomes easier to hide, not through lies, but through the quiet absence of truth. Discomfort when you succeed. Discomfort when you succeed is a subtle but revealing signal that the emotional alignment between you has shifted. In healthy bonds, one person's success feels shared. Pride, encouragement, and genuine happiness arise naturally. When betrayal begins to form, that shared emotional space fractures, and your growth starts to feel like a threat rather than a celebration. This discomfort may not show as open hostility. Instead, it appears as muted reactions, forced congratulations, or quick subject changes. Your achievements are minimized, overlooked, or met with quiet tension. Psychologically, this happens when someone has begun comparing rather than connecting. Your success highlights their internal conflict, insecurity, or guilt, especially if they are emotionally disengaging or investing elsewhere. What makes this signal emotionally painful is the absence of support where you expect it most. You may feel the need to downplay your wins to keep the peace. Joy becomes something you manage carefully instead of expressing freely. This creates an unconscious shrinking of self, where you make yourself smaller to avoid making them uncomfortable. Discomfort with your success also reflects a loss of emotional investment. When someone is preparing to detach, your progress no longer benefits their internal narrative. Instead of feeling proud of you, they feel displaced, left behind, or exposed. This emotional reaction is easier to tolerate when empathy has already begun to fade. Over time, this pattern erodes safety and trust. You stop sharing good news. You stop inviting them into your growth. The relationship becomes a place where your light feels unwelcome. When someone can no longer stand beside you in your success, it signals that their loyalty is no longer aligned with your well-being. Jealousy without cause. Jealousy without cause is a psychological signal that often reflects projection rather than perception. When someone becomes suspicious, possessive, or accusatory without evidence, it is rarely about your behavior. It is more often about what is happening inside their own mind. The emotions they experience are being displaced outward because facing their source would require uncomfortable self-examination. This form of jealousy appears suddenly and disproportionately. Innocent interactions are questioned. Neutral behaviors are reinterpreted as threats. The emotional intensity does not match the situation, creating confusion and defensiveness where none previously existed. This imbalance is revealing. The mind assumes others operate the way it does, and when someone is contemplating or engaging in betrayal, their awareness sharpens toward the possibility everywhere else. Emotionally, this is destabilizing. You may feel unfairly scrutinized, forced to defend yourself against imagined scenarios. Over time, this creates exhaustion and self-doubt. You begin modifying harmless behaviors to avoid triggering suspicion, shrinking your freedom in ways that quietly benefit the person projecting onto you. Jealousy without cause also serves as misdirection. By placing you on the defensive, attention is drawn away from their own actions. The emotional spotlight shifts, and the narrative becomes about your loyalty rather than theirs. What makes this signal particularly painful is the injustice of it. You are made to feel guilty for things you haven't done, while the real threat remains unaddressed. Betrayal often reveals itself through projection first. When jealousy appears without reason, it can be the mind confessing indirectly, exposing internal conflict by accusing the very loyalty it is beginning to abandon, projecting their behavior onto you. Projecting their behavior onto you is a psychological defense mechanism that activates when someone is struggling to contain guilt or self-awareness. Projection allows a person to displace uncomfortable truths about themselves by assigning those traits, motives, or actions to someone else. When betrayal is forming internally, this mechanism becomes especially active. This often shows up as unexpected accusations. You are questioned about intentions you never had, behaviors you never displayed, or thoughts that do not align with your actions. They may imply you are being secretive, dishonest, disloyal, or emotionally distant, even when there is little evidence to support it. The accusations feel misplaced, yet emotionally charged. Psychologically, projection serves to externalize inner conflict. By attributing their own impulses to you, they reduce the emotional pressure of confronting themselves. If you are framed as the problem, their behavior becomes reactive rather than responsible. Guilt transforms into justification. What makes this signal emotionally triggering is the confusion it creates. You may find yourself defending your character instead of examining the shift in theirs. The conversation moves away from their behavior and toward your innocence. Over time, this dynamic can make you doubt your own integrity and feel compelled to over-explain or self-monitor. Projection also destabilizes trust. When accusations replace transparency, the relationship becomes adversarial rather than cooperative. Emotional safety dissolves as you begin anticipating blame rather than understanding. This pattern often escalates as betrayal approaches. The more their inner conflict grows, the more urgently it must be displaced. By projecting their behavior onto you, they create psychological distance from their actions while slowly rewriting the narrative in which they are no longer the one at fault. Unexplained mood swings. Unexplained mood swings often surface when someone is carrying emotional contradictions they can't reconcile. One moment they are warm, engaged, and present. The next, they are distant, irritable, or emotionally flat. The shifts feel abrupt and disconnected from what's happening around them, leaving you confused about which version of them you're going to encounter. These mood changes are rarely random. They are the emotional residue of an internal conflict. When someone is entertaining thoughts or behaviors that clash with their self-image, the nervous system stays unsettled. Guilt, excitement, fear, and rationalization compete beneath the surface, and the emotional overflow leaks out in waves. What makes this signal emotionally triggering is the instability it creates for you. You may begin monitoring their tone, expressions, or energy, trying to predict the shift before it happens. This hyper-awareness pulls your focus away from your own emotional needs and anchors it to managing theirs. Emotional safety becomes conditional and unpredictable. Unexplained mood swings also distort communication. You may hesitate to bring things up, worried that the wrong moment will trigger withdrawal or irritation. Over time, this teaches you to self-silence in order to maintain temporary calm, even as the underlying issue remains unresolved. As these swings continue, the relationship starts to feel emotionally unsafe rather than supportive. Consistency disappears, replaced by tension and uncertainty. When someone's inner world becomes unstable, their emotional presence follows. Betrayal doesn't always announce itself through actions. Sometimes it reveals itself through emotional volatility that has no clear source but leaves lasting impact. Sudden value changes. Sudden value changes often signal an internal realignment that hasn't been openly acknowledged. Values are psychological anchors. They guide decisions, shape boundaries, and create a sense of predictability in how someone moves through the world. When those values shift abruptly, especially without meaningful reflection or dialogue, it suggests that something deeper is driving the change. This shift may show up as new beliefs that contradict long-held principles. Things they once considered unacceptable are now defended or dismissed. Commitments that once mattered are reframed as limiting or outdated. Psychologically, this happens when someone needs their values to adapt to their emerging behavior, not the other way around. Instead of resisting temptation or internal conflict, the mind adjusts the moral framework to reduce friction. What makes this signal emotionally unsettling is how destabilizing it feels. You may struggle to recognize the person you're interacting with. Conversations that once felt aligned now feel foreign. The shared understanding that grounded the relationship begins to dissolve, leaving you unsure of where they stand or what they believe. Sudden value changes also create emotional distance. Shared values are a form of trust. When they shift without explanation, trust weakens. You may hesitate to rely on them because the rules seem to change without warning. On a deeper level, this behavior allows betrayal to feel principled rather than impulsive. By redefining what is right, acceptable, or deserved, they can justify actions that once would have violated their own standards. When values change to match desire, loyalty becomes optional, and consistency is replaced by convenience. Moral flexibility where it didn't exist before. Moral flexibility where it didn't exist before is a psychological signal that reveals an internal shift in values, often driven by the need to justify future actions. When someone's core principles are stable, their judgments are consistent. When those principles begin to bend, it is usually not because morality has evolved, but because behavior is about to. This change often appears in conversation first. Actions they once criticized are suddenly understandable. Boundaries that were once firm become situational. Ethical lines are reframed as gray areas. The person may speak in justifications rather than convictions, signaling that their internal compass is being adjusted to reduce guilt rather than guide behavior. Emotionally, this can feel unsettling because it disrupts your sense of who they are. The traits you trusted, their integrity, their predictability, their values, no longer feel solid. You may sense that something fundamental has shifted, even if you can't point to a specific action yet. Moral flexibility also acts as psychological preparation. By redefining what is acceptable, the mind creates permission structures. If something is no longer wrong, then acting on it feels less threatening to their self-image. This internal negotiation often happens quietly, long before behavior changes outwardly. What makes this signal emotionally triggering is its subtlety. There is no confrontation, no confession, just a slow erosion of certainty. You begin wondering whether you're holding on to standards that no longer apply. Betrayal rarely begins with action. It begins with justification. When morality becomes flexible without clear growth or reflection, it often signals that loyalty is being redefined to accommodate choices that once would have been unthinkable. Rationalizing unethical behavior. Rationalizing unethical behavior is a psychological reprogramming process that occurs when someone needs to make wrongdoing feel acceptable. Before betrayal becomes an action, it must first become reasonable in the mind. Rationalization is how that transformation happens. What once would have triggered guilt is reframed as understandable, necessary, or even justified. This often begins with subtle language shifts. Rules are described as outdated. Boundaries are labeled unrealistic. Harm is minimized by intent rather than impact. They speak in explanations instead of responsibility, focusing on why something had to happen rather than whether it should have happened at all. Ethics become flexible, shaped to fit desire rather than principle. Psychologically, this behavior protects self-image. Most people need to see themselves as good, fair, or justified. When actions threaten that identity, the mind rewrites the moral framework instead of confronting the contradiction. Betrayal is no longer seen as betrayal, but as a response to circumstance, loneliness, pressure, or unmet needs. What makes this signal emotionally unsettling is how it distorts reality. You may hear explanations that sound logical on the surface but feel hollow underneath. Your discomfort is treated as naivety, rigidity, or emotionality. Over time, this can make you question your own moral compass while theirs quietly shifts. Rationalizing unethical behavior also removes the internal brakes. Once the mind accepts that values are negotiable, future actions face less resistance. Each justification makes the next one easier, creating momentum toward deeper violations. This signal marks a critical psychological turning point. When ethics are no longer anchors but tools, loyalty becomes conditional, harm becomes explainable, and betrayal stops feeling wrong long before it actually happens. Increased self-centeredness. Increased self-centeredness appears when someone's attention turns inward in a way that leaves little room for mutual awareness. Conversations begin orbiting around their needs, their stress, their goals, and their feelings, while yours receive minimal curiosity or emotional space. The shift feels subtle at first, but over time, it becomes a pattern where empathy feels one-sided. This change often signals internal prioritization. When a person is contemplating betrayal, their psychological focus narrows. Managing internal conflict, desire, or justification requires mental energy, and that energy is often taken from relational awareness. The self becomes the center, not out of confidence, but out of preoccupation. What makes this signal emotionally draining is the imbalance it creates. You may find yourself listening more, giving more, and adjusting more, while receiving less in return. Your experiences are acknowledged briefly, if at all, before the focus redirects back to them. This can leave you feeling unseen even while being physically present. Increased self-centeredness also serves a protective function. By keeping the emotional spotlight on themselves, they avoid deeper engagement with your perspective, which could challenge their internal narrative or invite accountability. Empathy becomes inconvenient when it threatens self-justification. Over time, this behavior erodes emotional reciprocity. The relationship shifts from shared to skewed, from mutual to transactional. You begin adapting to their emotional gravity, slowly shrinking your own needs to maintain harmony. In that environment, betrayal becomes easier to rationalize because the relationship has already been reframed internally as revolving around them rather than existing as a shared emotional space. Reduced vulnerability. Reduced vulnerability is a quiet emotional retreat that often happens when someone is preparing to protect themselves rather than connect. Vulnerability requires trust, openness, and a willingness to be seen. When betrayal begins forming, those qualities become risky. The person starts closing emotional doors not because they are stronger, but because they are hiding something they no longer want exposed. This reduction shows up as emotional self-containment. They stop sharing fears, doubts, or inner struggles. Conversations stay surface level. When asked how they truly feel, the answers are vague or deflected. Psychologically, vulnerability threatens secrecy. Being open invites questions, empathy, and emotional reciprocity, all of which make it harder to maintain a divided inner life. What makes this signal emotionally triggering is the sudden imbalance it creates. You may still be open, expressive, and emotionally available, while they become guarded and distant. This asymmetry can make you feel exposed, as if you're sharing into a void. Over time, you may start withholding your own vulnerability to protect yourself from rejection. Reduced vulnerability also weakens emotional intimacy. Without emotional openness, connection becomes transactional rather than bonded. You may feel like you're interacting with a version of them that is edited, controlled, and emotionally inaccessible. On a deeper level, this withdrawal allows them to detach without confrontation. By sealing off their inner world, they reduce emotional accountability and make separation easier to justify. When vulnerability disappears, loyalty soon follows, because genuine connection cannot survive where openness is no longer allowed to exist. Avoiding emotional conversations. Avoiding emotional conversations is a psychological signal that reveals an unwillingness to engage where truth lives. Emotional dialogue requires presence, vulnerability, and alignment between inner experience and outward expression. When someone begins consistently steering away from these conversations, it often reflects an internal conflict they are not ready or willing to face. This avoidance can be subtle. Topics are changed when feelings are mentioned. Responses become shallow, practical, or dismissive when emotions surface. Moments that invite connection are met with distraction, humor, or silence. Over time, the emotional depth that once existed begins to flatten, replaced by surface-level interaction. Emotionally, this creates loneliness even in proximity. You may find yourself feeling unseen or emotionally stranded, as though the person is physically present but psychologically unreachable. This absence is particularly painful because it deprives you of reassurance, clarity, and mutual understanding, the very elements that sustain trust. Avoiding emotional conversations also functions as self-protection. Emotional honesty increases the risk of exposure. It invites questions, reflection, and accountability. When someone is harboring conflicting feelings or hidden intentions, emotional conversations feel dangerous, not because they are harmful, but because they threaten concealment. What makes this signal so destabilizing is the way it silences resolution. Issues remain unspoken, tensions remain unresolved, and assumptions quietly replace clarity. You may stop initiating these conversations altogether, learning that emotional openness leads nowhere. Betrayal thrives in emotional avoidance. When feelings are consistently bypassed, connection weakens, truth stays hidden, and the relationship becomes a place where silence protects secrets more than words protect trust. Being overly agreeable to avoid scrutiny. Being overly agreeable to avoid scrutiny is a psychological camouflage strategy that appears when someone is trying to stay beneath the surface. Agreement becomes a way to prevent attention, reduce questioning, and keep conversations from going deeper than they can safely manage. Instead of engaging honestly, they smooth everything over. This behavior often looks like sudden compliance. They agree quickly, avoid disagreement, and offer reassurance without substance. On the surface, this can feel pleasant or cooperative, but psychologically, excessive agreeableness is not about harmony. It is about risk management. The less friction there is, the fewer opportunities there are for probing questions or emotional exposure. The mind uses agreeableness as a distraction. By aligning with you too easily, they redirect focus away from themselves. Conflict invites scrutiny. Disagreement invites discussion. Agreement ends the conversation. This allows them to maintain control over what is explored and what remains hidden. What makes this signal emotionally disorienting is the lack of depth it creates. Conversations feel resolved too quickly. Concerns are acknowledged but not truly addressed. You may feel momentarily soothed, yet strangely unsatisfied, sensing that something important has been bypassed rather than understood. Over time, this pattern erodes trust in a subtle way. You stop feeling met, challenged, or engaged. Emotional exchange becomes shallow, transactional, and safe only on the surface. Being overly agreeable is not the same as being aligned. It is often a sign of emotional evasion. When someone chooses smoothness over truth, it suggests there are areas they cannot afford to examine too closely, because what might be revealed would disrupt the stability they are working so hard to maintain. Withholding information. Withholding information is a quiet but deliberate psychological shift where truth is no longer freely offered, only selectively released. It's not always about direct lies, but about what remains unsaid. Details are skipped, explanations are delayed, and important context is conveniently missing. You sense that knowledge is being rationed rather than shared. This behavior often develops when openness feels risky. When someone anticipates judgment, confrontation, or emotional consequence, they begin managing information as a form of self-protection. Silence becomes safer than honesty. By controlling what you know, they control how much you can question, understand, or react. What makes withholding information emotionally unsettling is how it destabilizes trust without creating a clear confrontation. You may feel something is off, yet struggle to explain why. Conversations leave you with unanswered questions, but no obvious reason to challenge what wasn't said. This ambiguity invites self-doubt and overthinking. Withholding also creates an invisible hierarchy. One person holds knowledge, the other holds uncertainty. That imbalance shifts power quietly but effectively. You may find yourself dependent on fragments of truth, adjusting your expectations around incomplete information. Over time, this pattern erodes emotional safety. Shared reality begins to fracture, replaced by partial truths and unspoken gaps. You stop feeling included in their inner world and start feeling managed. Betrayal thrives in this space, not because of dramatic deception, but because truth has been quietly removed from the foundation of connection, leaving silence to do the damage instead. Speaking in half-truths. Speaking in half-truths is a psychological balancing act between honesty and concealment. Instead of fully lying, the person offers fragments of truth arranged in a way that hides the larger reality. This allows them to appear transparent while still protecting what they don't want revealed. When betrayal is forming, this becomes an efficient way to manage guilt without surrendering control. Half-truths often sound convincing because parts of them are real. Details are selectively shared while critical context is omitted. The story is technically accurate, yet emotionally misleading. Psychologically, this reduces internal conflict. They can tell themselves they didn't lie, even though the truth was never fully given. What makes this signal emotionally destabilizing is how hard it is to confront. You sense something is off, but can't easily point to what's wrong. Each statement seems reasonable on its own, which makes questioning it feel unfair or paranoid. Over time, this erodes your confidence in your perception and trains you to accept incomplete explanations. Speaking in half-truths also creates emotional exhaustion. You may find yourself piecing together conversations, reading between the lines, or searching for clarity that never fully arrives. This keeps you mentally engaged but emotionally unsatisfied. On a deeper level, half-truths preserve a false sense of trust. They maintain the appearance of honesty while quietly dismantling its substance. When someone consistently filters reality instead of sharing it fully, they are practicing emotional distance. Betrayal doesn't require outright lies to exist. It only needs enough truth to pass inspection and enough omission to remain hidden. Frequent "I forgot" excuses. Frequent "I forgot" excuses are a psychological signal that often indicates selective attention rather than genuine memory lapses. Forgetting happens to everyone, but when it becomes a repeated response, especially around commitments, conversations, or details that require accountability, it suggests that the mind is disengaging from responsibility in subtle ways. This pattern usually appears around emotionally inconvenient moments. Important discussions are forgotten. Agreements are vaguely remembered or not at all. Promises seem to dissolve without emotional weight. The repetition is what gives this signal its meaning. Forgetting becomes a convenient shield that avoids confrontation without direct refusal. Emotionally, this is deeply frustrating. You may feel unimportant, dismissed, or taken for granted. Over time, repeated "I forgot" responses can erode your sense of worth, making you question whether your needs or words truly matter. The emotional message received is not just forgetfulness, but lack of prioritization. Psychologically, frequent forgetting can also reflect internal conflict. When someone is balancing multiple narratives or obligations, the mind unconsciously filters out information that threatens comfort or exposes inconsistency. Forgetting becomes a way to maintain internal equilibrium without addressing the underlying issue. What makes this signal emotionally triggering is its plausible deniability. There is no clear wrongdoing to confront, only a pattern that leaves you feeling unheard and unconsidered. You may hesitate to express frustration, unsure whether it's fair to hold someone accountable for what they claim not to remember. Betrayal does not always announce itself with lies. Sometimes it hides behind indifference. When "I forgot" becomes a habit, it often signals that emotional investment has shifted elsewhere, leaving shared commitments quietly fading into the background. Testing boundaries subtly. Testing boundaries subtly is a psychological probing behavior that often appears before overt betrayal. Rather than crossing lines abruptly, the mind prefers to inch toward them, observing reactions and adjusting accordingly. These small tests are rarely obvious. They are framed as jokes, hypotheticals, minor favors, or seemingly harmless deviations from what was previously respected. Psychologically, this behavior serves as reconnaissance. Each subtle boundary test gathers information. How much resistance is there? How quickly is it challenged? How uncomfortable does the other person become? The answers help determine how far future actions can go without consequence. Boundaries that are not reinforced are mentally logged as negotiable. What makes this signal emotionally unsettling is its ambiguity. You may sense discomfort, but struggle to articulate why. The behavior is just mild enough to make confrontation feel unnecessary or dramatic. As a result, you may let it pass, even though your intuition signals misalignment. Testing boundaries also allows the person to preserve plausible deniability. If challenged, they can minimize, joke, or claim misunderstanding. This protects their self-image while still advancing the boundary slightly forward. Over time, these small shifts compound. What once would have felt unacceptable becomes familiar. The emotional terrain changes gradually, lowering resistance and increasing tolerance. Each unchallenged test normalizes the next one. This behavior is not about curiosity. It is about calibration. When someone tests boundaries subtly, they are measuring how much integrity the relationship can absorb before breaking. Betrayal rarely arrives without warning. It often walks in slowly, step by step, through boundaries that were softened long before they were crossed. Fishing for reassurance excessively. Fishing for reassurance excessively occurs when someone seeks constant confirmation of their goodness, loyalty, or value, often without clear reason. They may ask if you trust them, if you're happy, or if you think they're a good person, repeating these questions in ways that feel anxious rather than affectionate. The reassurance they seek never seems to last. This behavior often signals internal guilt or uncertainty. When someone's actions or thoughts are drifting away from their values, their self-image becomes unstable. Instead of confronting the source of that instability, they look outward for validation. Your reassurance becomes a temporary emotional anesthetic, soothing discomfort they aren't ready to face honestly. What makes this signal emotionally draining is the hidden burden it places on you. You may feel responsible for stabilizing their emotions, even though you don't understand why reassurance is suddenly needed so often. Over time, this can make you feel like you're managing their conscience rather than sharing a relationship. Excessive reassurance seeking also subtly reverses accountability. By positioning themselves as insecure or misunderstood, they shift attention away from their behavior and toward your role in making them feel safe. This discourages deeper questioning and keeps conversations centered on comfort rather than truth. As this pattern continues, reassurance loses its meaning. No amount of validation satisfies the underlying conflict. You may begin to feel emotionally used, offering thoughtfulness that never resolves anything. In that space, betrayal remains hidden behind vulnerability, protected by the very reassurance meant to strengthen trust, but instead quietly sustaining its erosion. Loss of shared humor. Loss of shared humor is a subtle emotional fracture that often goes unnoticed until the connection already feels thinner. Shared humor is not just about laughter, it is a private language built from mutual understanding, timing, and emotional safety. When that humor fades, it signals that the emotional rhythm between you has fallen out of sync. This change often appears gradually. Jokes that once landed now fall flat. Playful teasing is met with blank expressions or mild irritation. Moments that once invited laughter are treated seriously or ignored altogether. Psychologically, humor requires presence and emotional attunement. When someone begins detaching, they lose the spontaneity needed to share that lightness. What makes this signal emotionally painful is what it removes. Humor is one of the fastest ways humans bond. It reassures us that we are seen, understood, and emotionally aligned. When it disappears, interactions begin to feel heavier, more formal, and emotionally distant. You may find yourself holding back, unsure of how they will respond. Loss of shared humor also reflects a shift in emotional investment. Laughter requires effort without obligation. When someone is emotionally withdrawing, they often stop investing in moments that don't serve a purpose beyond connection itself. Over time, the absence of humor creates a quieter kind of loneliness. Conversations feel functional rather than joyful. The relationship becomes about logistics instead of shared experience. When laughter fades, it signals that the emotional bond is loosening, making room for distance and secrecy. Betrayal doesn't always arrive through conflict. Sometimes it enters through the slow disappearance of joy. Decreased emotional responsiveness. Decreased emotional responsiveness is a psychological signal that reveals emotional withdrawal in its earliest, quietest form. It is not about what is said, but about what no longer comes back to you. Reactions that once felt warm, immediate, and engaged become delayed, muted, or absent altogether. Your emotions land, but they no longer echo. This shift often begins subtly. Excitement is met with neutral acknowledgement. Distress receives minimal comfort. Moments that once sparked connection now feel like they disappear into a void. The person is present, yet emotionally distant, as if their inner world is slowly closing its doors. Emotionally, this creates a profound sense of isolation. Humans rely on emotional feedback to feel seen and safe. When responsiveness fades, you may start amplifying your feelings just to be noticed or suppressing them to avoid disappointment. Either response pulls you away from your authentic emotional state. Decreased responsiveness often reflects divided emotional attention. When someone's emotional energy is invested elsewhere, internally or externally, the capacity to respond meaningfully diminishes. They are not necessarily cold, they are preoccupied, detached, or emotionally redirected. What makes this signal particularly painful is its ambiguity. There is no argument, no rejection, only absence. You may struggle to articulate what feels wrong because nothing overt has happened, yet the connection feels thinner, less alive. Betrayal often begins with emotional departure. When emotional responsiveness declines, it signals that the bond is no longer being actively maintained. The body remains, the words remain, but the emotional presence, the glue of trust and intimacy, has already started to dissolve. Becoming hard to reach. Becoming hard to reach is a psychological distancing behavior that often signals a shift in emotional availability. Accessibility is one of the clearest indicators of priority. When someone begins to delay responses, miss calls, or regularly become unavailable without clear explanation, it suggests that their attention is being redirected elsewhere. This change rarely happens all at once. Response times stretch. Messages go unanswered longer than they used to. Availability becomes inconsistent and unpredictable. Each instance seems minor, but together they form a pattern of absence that feels increasingly intentional. Psychologically, this behavior reduces accountability. Being unreachable creates space where questions cannot be asked and explanations cannot be demanded. It allows the person to operate without immediate emotional consequences. Distance becomes a buffer that protects them from confrontation, guilt, or the need to clarify their actions. What makes this signal emotionally triggering is the uncertainty it creates. You may find yourself checking your phone more often, rereading messages, or wondering if you said something wrong. The lack of response invites self-doubt and anxiety, even when the change did not originate with you. Becoming hard to reach also shifts the emotional balance. You wait while they decide when to reappear. Control over connection moves away from mutuality and toward convenience. This imbalance can make you feel less valued and more disposable. Over time, unavailability becomes a form of emotional withdrawal. Presence is no longer consistent, and reassurance is delayed or absent. This pattern quietly prepares emotional separation by normalizing absence, making the eventual distance feel less abrupt because it has already been practiced in silence. Ignoring messages selectively. Ignoring messages selectively is a modern form of emotional control that creates distance without open confrontation. Messages go unanswered, not because they're unseen, but because responding feels inconvenient or risky. You may notice patterns. Some messages receive quick replies, others are delayed or ignored entirely, often the ones that require emotional presence, explanation, or accountability. This behavior often signals internal avoidance. When someone is managing conflicting priorities or hidden thoughts, certain interactions trigger discomfort. Rather than engage, they choose silence. Selective ignoring allows them to maintain connection on their terms while avoiding conversations that could expose emotional shifts or inconsistencies. What makes this signal emotionally unsettling is the unpredictability. You're left wondering why one message mattered and another didn't. This uncertainty pulls you into overanalysis, replaying your words, questioning your tone, and adjusting future messages to avoid being ignored again. Emotional energy shifts from connection to self-monitoring. Selective ignoring also establishes an imbalance of power. The person who decides when communication happens controls the emotional tempo of the relationship. You wait, they decide. Over time, this conditions you to lower expectations and suppress needs to preserve responsiveness. As this pattern continues, silence becomes a language of avoidance. Important topics fade away not because they were resolved, but because they were never answered. The relationship begins to operate around gaps rather than dialogue, making emotional distance feel normalized and betrayal easier to conceal behind the excuse of being busy or distracted, while intention quietly replaces coincidence. being present physically but absent mentally. Being present physically but absent mentally is one of the most disorienting signals because it creates the illusion of connection without its substance. They are there, sitting beside you, responding when spoken to, participating just enough to appear engaged. Yet, something essential is missing. Their attention feels elsewhere, fragmented, unreachable. Psychologically, this state reflects divided emotional investment. The body remains out of habit, obligation, or convenience, while the mind has begun relocating to another emotional focus. This could be another person, an internal narrative, or a future they are quietly rehearsing. Presence requires alignment. When alignment breaks, attention drifts. What makes this signal emotionally triggering is how invalidating it feels. You may sense that you're talking to someone who isn't fully listening, sharing moments that don't fully register. This can make you feel invisible, as though your words are landing in empty space. Over time, you may start repeating yourself, exaggerating emotions, or withdrawing just to protect your sense of dignity. Mental absence also reduces accountability. When someone isn't fully mentally present, emotional responsibility becomes diluted. They miss cues, forget important details, and respond superficially. This creates emotional loneliness even in shared space. On a deeper level, this detachment allows emotional separation without confrontation. They can slowly disengage while maintaining appearances. The relationship looks intact from the outside, but inside, connection is thinning. When someone is only present in body, it often means their loyalty has already started migrating somewhere. Their mind feels more alive. Sudden privacy demands are a psychological signal that reveal a shift from shared openness to guarded separation. Privacy in healthy relationships exists alongside transparency. When someone abruptly insists on new boundaries without context, explanation, or gradual adjustment, it often signals that something now needs protection. This change frequently appears around areas that were once neutral. Devices become off-limits. Questions are framed as invasions. Ordinary curiosity is recast as control. The demand itself is not the issue. It is the timing and intensity that reveal an internal change. What was once shared now feels defended. Emotionally, this creates insecurity. You may feel shut out, mistrusted, or accused simply for noticing the shift. The suddenness leaves little room for understanding, only confusion. Your nervous system registers the boundary not as safety, but as exclusion. Psychologically, sudden privacy demands function as a shield. They create distance between behavior and accountability. By redefining access as inappropriate, the person reduces the likelihood of discovery and justifies concealment under the language of autonomy. What makes this signal emotionally triggering is the reversal it creates. Transparency is reframed as entitlement. Trust is portrayed as surveillance. This inversion destabilizes the relationship, leaving you unsure what is reasonable to ask or expect. Over time, these demands normalize emotional distance. You stop inquiring, not because curiosity disappears, but because questioning feels risky. Silence replaces dialogue. Betrayal requires protected space. Sudden privacy demands carve out that space psychologically first, teaching the mind that secrecy can be defended as self-respect while connection quietly erodes behind closed boundaries. Treating trust as a burden. Treating trust as a burden is a psychological shift that occurs when someone no longer wants the responsibility that trust demands. Trust requires consistency, transparency, and consideration. When a person begins to experience those expectations as pressure rather than privilege, it signals a growing internal resistance to accountability. This often appears in subtle complaints. They speak about feeling monitored, constrained, or suffocated, even when no control is being exerted. ordinary expectations are reframed as demands, openness becomes too much, and reassurance is treated as exhausting. The language shifts from shared responsibility to personal inconvenience. Psychologically, this happens when trust conflicts with hidden intentions. Transparency threatens secrecy. Reliability threatens flexibility. To preserve freedom of action, the mind recasts trust as unreasonable rather than necessary. The problem is no longer their behavior, but the expectation that they should be trustworthy at all. What makes this signal emotionally destabilizing is the guilt it places on you. You may begin minimizing your needs, apologizing for seeking clarity, or questioning whether trust itself is unfair. The emotional standard quietly drops, not because it should, but because maintaining it creates tension. Treating trust as a burden also alters the power dynamic. They position themselves as constrained by your expectations, while you are framed as asking for too much. This reframing allows them to justify distance and secrecy without appearing overtly disloyal. When trust becomes framed as an obstacle rather than a foundation, loyalty begins to feel optional. This psychological shift clears the internal path for betrayal by redefining integrity as restriction and freedom, as something that must be protected from closeness rather than built through it. Increased stress with no clear cause. Increased stress with no clear cause often appears when someone is mentally carrying more than they are willing to share. They seem tense, distracted, or on edge, yet can't point to a specific reason why. Their energy feels compressed, as if they're constantly bracing for something, even during calm moments. This kind of stress usually comes from internal pressure rather than external circumstances. When a person is juggling hidden thoughts, secrets, or conflicting desires, the nervous system stays activated. The mind is busy monitoring behavior, maintaining consistency, and anticipating exposure. That constant vigilance creates strain that eventually surfaces as irritability, fatigue, or emotional withdrawal. What makes this signal emotionally triggering is the way it disrupts connection. You may sense their tension and try to help, only to be met with vague responses or dismissal. This can leave you feeling shut out, concerned, and helpless at the same time. The lack of explanation creates a gap where empathy has nowhere to land. Unexplained stress also changes the emotional atmosphere. Simple interactions feel heavier. Light moments disappear. You may find yourself walking carefully, trying not to add to their burden, even though you don't understand what you're avoiding. This slowly shifts the relationship dynamic toward caution instead of comfort. Over time, increased stress without clarity becomes a warning signal of internal conflict. When someone's emotional load grows but their openness shrinks, the pressure has to go somewhere. Often, it leaks out in ways that strain trust and intimacy, revealing that something beneath the surface is demanding far more energy than they are willing to admit. Overreacting to innocent questions. Overreacting to innocent questions is a psychological alarm that sounds when curiosity collides with something someone is trying to protect. The question itself is rarely the issue. It is what the question threatens to uncover. When simple, neutral inquiries trigger irritation, anger, or exaggerated defensiveness, it suggests that the person is guarding more than they are willing to admit. Psychologically, this reaction comes from anticipation rather than accusation. The mind interprets even harmless curiosity as danger because it brushes against hidden territory. Instead of answering calmly, the nervous system activates, pushing the person into fight mode. The emotional intensity of the response far outweighs the simplicity of the question. What makes this signal emotionally unsettling is how quickly it shifts the atmosphere. A conversation that felt safe suddenly feels volatile. You may feel shocked, confused, or even ashamed for asking something reasonable. This conditions you to hesitate, to second-guess yourself, and eventually to stop asking questions altogether. Over time, this pattern creates emotional silence. You learn that curiosity has consequences and clarity comes at a cost. This protects secrecy while placing emotional strain on you because unanswered questions don't disappear, they accumulate. On a deeper level, overreacting serves as a deterrent. It teaches you that certain topics are off limits without ever explicitly saying so. This allows betrayal to stay hidden behind emotional intensity rather than logic. When someone reacts too strongly to harmless questions, it often means the truth is too close for comfort, and fear, not innocence, is driving the response. Changing communication patterns. Changing communication patterns are a psychological signal that reveal internal realignment before it becomes visible externally. Communication is one of the most stable behavioral rhythms in close relationships. When that rhythm shifts without explanation, it often reflects a change in emotional availability, priorities, or focus. This change can appear in many forms. Messages become shorter, delayed, or less expressive. The tone shifts from warm to neutral, from curious to functional. Calls that once felt engaging now feel rushed or infrequent. Even when contact still exists, its texture is different, thinner, less emotionally invested. Emotionally, this creates unease. You may sense that something has changed but struggle to articulate what it is. The connection feels less alive, yet nothing concrete has happened to point to. This ambiguity keeps you alert, scanning for meaning in small shifts, which can be mentally exhausting. Changing communication patterns often signal divided attention. When emotional energy is redirected elsewhere, the effort once invested in communication diminishes. The person may not consciously withdraw, but their responsiveness reflects what currently holds their focus. What makes this signal emotionally destabilizing is the quiet recalibration it forces on you. You may begin adjusting your own communication, waiting longer to respond, sharing less, or pulling back emotionally to protect yourself. This mutual retreat accelerates distance without either person explicitly choosing it. Betrayal rarely arrives suddenly. It unfolds through small behavioral shifts that rewire connection over time. Changing communication patterns are the early footprints of that shift, signaling that the emotional channel between you is being slowly, silently reconfigured. Using humor to deflect seriousness. Using humor to deflect seriousness is a psychological avoidance strategy that allows someone to sidestep emotional exposure without appearing resistant. Humor lightens the atmosphere, but when used repeatedly at moments that require honesty, it becomes a tool for evasion rather than connection. This behavior often appears when conversations approach vulnerable or uncomfortable territory. Instead of engaging, they joke, tease, exaggerate, or make light of the concern. Laughter replaces reflection. Wit replaces accountability. The moment passes, unresolved, but emotionally disarmed. Psychologically, humor acts as a pressure release valve. Serious discussions demand presence, self-awareness, and emotional risk. When someone is carrying internal conflict or hidden intentions, that risk feels dangerous. Humor offers a socially acceptable exit that avoids confrontation while maintaining likability. What makes this signal emotionally disorienting is the confusion it creates. You may feel momentarily eased, yet subtly dismissed. The issue remains, but addressing it again feels harder, almost heavy, as if you are disrupting something lighthearted or overreacting to just a joke. Over time, this pattern trains avoidance. Important conversations lose momentum. Emotional depth is replaced by surface interaction. You may stop bringing up concerns altogether, sensing that seriousness will never be met with seriousness. Using humor this way also protects secrecy. It keeps discussions shallow and prevents sustained focus on topics that could reveal misalignment. While humor can strengthen bonds, deflective humor does the opposite. It signals that certain truths cannot be approached directly, and when honesty becomes something to laugh away, emotional distance quietly takes its place. Avoiding accountability language. Avoiding accountability language is a subtle but powerful psychological shift where responsibility quietly disappears from someone's words. Instead of saying, "I did," "I chose," or "I should have," they lean on vague phrasing like "things happened," "it just turned out that way," or "you know how situations get." Actions lose ownership and become events without an author. This shift often occurs when someone is distancing themselves from the consequences of their behavior. Accountability requires alignment between action and identity. When that alignment becomes uncomfortable, language adapts to reduce emotional exposure. By removing themselves from the center of the sentence, they also remove themselves from responsibility. What makes this signal emotionally disorienting is how slippery it feels. You may leave conversations feeling unsatisfied, sensing that something important was acknowledged but never truly owned. Without clear responsibility, there is nothing to resolve and no ground for repair. The issue remains floating, unresolved, and strangely untouchable. Avoiding accountability language also protects internal narratives. If actions are framed as circumstantial or accidental, guilt becomes easier to manage. The person can maintain a self-image of being reasonable or blameless while still benefiting from the outcome of their choices. Over time, this erosion of ownership weakens trust. You begin to realize that clarity is being avoided on purpose, not out of confusion, but out of self-preservation. When responsibility is consistently softened or redirected, honesty loses its anchor and betrayal becomes easier to rationalize because no one is ever fully admitting to choosing it. Speaking in absolutes defensively. Speaking in absolutes defensively is a psychological attempt to shut down uncertainty by force. Words like always, never, nothing, and everyone appear when someone wants to end a conversation rather than explore it. When betrayal is forming, nuance becomes dangerous because nuance invites examination. Absolutes feel safer because they leave no room for follow-up. This pattern often emerges during moments of tension or questioning. Instead of addressing the specific issue, the person escalates the language. A single concern is reframed as an attack on their entire character. By exaggerating the scope, they redirect attention away from the original topic and toward defending an extreme position. Psychologically, absolutes provide emotional armor. They simplify complex situations into rigid statements that protect the person from vulnerability. If something is framed as never happening or always being true, it discourages further inquiry. Challenging an absolute feels exhausting and often pointless, which is exactly why it's used. What makes this signal emotionally triggering is how invalidating it feels. Your experience is erased by language that leaves no space for your perspective. You may feel dismissed, misunderstood, or silenced, even though you were trying to communicate honestly. Over time, this style of communication reshapes the relationship. Conversations become polarized rather than collaborative. Emotional safety erodes because expressing uncertainty or concern is met with verbal walls instead of openness. When someone relies on absolutes to defend themselves, it often means they are protecting a fragile truth that cannot withstand careful examination. Increased reliance on others emotionally. Increased reliance on others emotionally is a psychological signal that often indicates emotional displacement rather than expansion. Emotional closeness is not limitless. When deep emotional energy is redirected outward, it is usually withdrawn from somewhere else. When someone begins consistently leaning on others for support, validation, or intimacy that once existed between you, it reflects a shift in emotional allegiance. This change often appears subtly. They speak more about how someone else understands them, comforts them, or is just easier to talk to. Emotional struggles are processed elsewhere while you receive summaries or silence. The bond doesn't break dramatically. It thins quietly as emotional exchange is outsourced. Emotionally, this can feel like being slowly replaced. You may sense that you are no longer the first point of connection. even if your role hasn't been formally redefined. This creates insecurity, not because connection with others is wrong, but because your shared emotional channel is no longer primary. Psychologically, increased reliance on others reduces emotional accountability within the relationship. Difficult feelings are resolved externally, removing the need for vulnerability or repair with you. This makes emotional distance easier to maintain and harder to address. What makes this signal particularly painful is its invisibility. There may be no conflict, no overt rejection, just a quiet redistribution of intimacy. You are still present, but no longer central. Betrayal often begins emotionally before it becomes behavioral. When someone consistently turns elsewhere for emotional fulfillment, it signals that attachment is shifting. Loyalty erodes not through abandonment, but through the slow transfer of emotional dependency to someone outside the bond you once shared. Disappearing during critical moments. Disappearing during critical moments is a psychological abandonment signal that reveals where emotional commitment truly stands. Critical moments require presence, prioritization, and emotional investment. When someone repeatedly becomes unavailable during times of stress, conflict, or need, it suggests that showing up has become optional rather than essential. This behavior often carries plausible explanations. They are busy, overwhelmed, or unable to engage right now. Yet the timing is what matters. Their absence aligns not with inconvenience, but with moments that demand accountability, support, or difficult conversation. When stakes rise, they vanish. Psychologically, this is an avoidance response. Critical moments force alignment between words and actions. They demand emotional labor and clarity. For someone internally conflicted or preparing to detach, these moments feel threatening. Disappearing provides escape without confrontation, allowing them to postpone responsibility indefinitely. What makes this signal deeply emotionally triggering is the sense of abandonment it creates. You are left managing stress, pain, or uncertainty alone, often questioning whether your needs are valid or excessive. The absence hurts more because it occurs when presence matters most. Over time, this pattern reshapes expectations. You stop relying on them. You brace for solitude in moments where partnership should exist. Emotional independence becomes a defense rather than a choice. Disappearing during critical moments also normalizes emotional withdrawal. Absence becomes familiar. Support becomes unreliable. This quiet erosion of presence prepares the emotional ground for betrayal, because a person who is not there when it matters most has already stepped away from the role trust requires, even if they have not yet admitted it aloud. Reduced investment in problem solving. Reduced investment in problem solving appears when someone stops trying not because the issue is unsolvable, but because their emotional commitment has already shifted. Conversations that once involved effort, compromise, and curiosity now end quickly or are met with indifference. Problems are acknowledged briefly, then abandoned, as if resolution no longer matters. This shift often signals internal detachment. When a person is aligned with a relationship, they experience problems as shared challenges. When betrayal begins forming internally, problems become inconveniences rather than responsibilities. Investing energy into fixing things feels pointless if they've already emotionally stepped back. What makes this signal emotionally painful is the sense of abandonment it creates. You may still be trying to communicate, repair, or understand while they seem disengaged or resigned. The imbalance leaves you carrying the emotional labor alone, questioning whether the relationship is worth fighting for if only one person is fighting. Reduced problem solving also functions as avoidance. Engaging deeply could lead to clarity, confrontation, or decisions they aren't ready to face. By staying passive, they delay accountability and maintain emotional distance without openly ending anything. Over time, this lack of effort erodes trust more than conflict ever could. Disagreements aren't dangerous. Indifference is. When someone stops investing in solutions, they are often already invested elsewhere emotionally. The relationship shifts from something being built together into something slowly neglected, where unresolved issues pile up not because they couldn't be fixed, but because fixing them no longer aligns with their inner direction. Treating loyalty as conditional. Treating loyalty as conditional is a psychological shift where commitment is no longer grounded in connection, but in compliance. Loyalty stops being something freely given and becomes something you must continually earn. When betrayal is forming, this reframing allows the person to keep emotional power while slowly loosening their own obligations. This condition often appears through subtle statements or attitudes. Support is offered only when you behave a certain way. Understanding is withdrawn when you challenge them. Care feels transactional, tied to how convenient or agreeable you are in the moment. Psychologically, this allows them to justify emotional withdrawal without seeing themselves as disloyal. If loyalty is conditional, then withholding it feels reasonable. What makes this signal emotionally destabilizing is the insecurity it creates. You may find yourself monitoring your words, emotions, or boundaries to avoid triggering distance. Love and trust no longer feel stable, they feel negotiable. This keeps you focused on maintaining approval rather than recognizing the imbalance. Conditional loyalty also erodes mutual respect. Instead of standing with you through discomfort, they position themselves above you, deciding when you deserve commitment. This dynamic reduces empathy and increases entitlement. On a deeper level, this behavior prepares the reminder for betrayal. If loyalty depends on conditions, then breaking it can always be justified. There will always be a reason, a failure, or a flaw to point to. By redefining loyalty as something you must earn, they free themselves to step away while convincing themselves they had no other choice. Growing resentment. Growing resentment is a psychological signal that reveals unresolved conflict fermenting beneath the surface. Resentment does not appear suddenly, it accumulates quietly through unmet needs, unspoken grievances, and suppressed emotions. When it begins to surface, it often does so indirectly, disguised as irritation, withdrawal, or subtle hostility. This resentment may show up in tone before words. Small issues trigger disproportionate reactions. Neutral comments are met with defensiveness or sarcasm. There is an undercurrent of tension that makes interactions feel heavier, as if something is always on the verge of spilling out, but never quite does. Emotionally, growing resentment is destabilizing because it feels personal yet undefined. You may sense disapproval without knowing its source. This ambiguity can lead you to overanalyze your behavior, trying to prevent conflict that hasn't been clearly expressed. The emotional burden shifts onto you to maintain balance without clarity. Psychologically, resentment functions as justification. When someone harbors unresolved bitterness, it becomes easier to rationalize emotional withdrawal or harmful behavior. The mind reframes actions as deserved rather than destructive. Resentment turns disconnection into a narrative of self-protection. What makes this signal particularly damaging is its corrosive nature. Unlike anger, which seeks release, resentment lingers. It slowly erodes empathy, patience, and goodwill. The relationship continues, but warmth is replaced by obligation or tolerance. Betrayal often grows in resentful soil. When grievances are left unspoken and unresolved, emotional bonds weaken. Resentment creates emotional distance while preserving surface normalcy, allowing disloyal thoughts and justifications to take root without immediate resistance. Contemptuous microexpressions. Contemptuous microexpressions are fleeting emotional leaks that reveal what words are trying to hide. They appear for a fraction of a second. A subtle eye roll, a tightened lip, a smirk of superiority, a flash of disgust, often gone before you can consciously register them. Yet, emotionally, they land with force. You feel them before you understand them. Contempt is not frustration or anger. It is moral positioning. It signals that one person has begun to see themselves as above the other. Psychologically, contempt emerges when respect erodes and empathy collapses. When betrayal is forming internally, contempt helps the mind justify it. It reframes the other person as lesser, flawed, or undeserving, making disloyal thoughts feel earned rather than shameful. Microexpressions are especially revealing because they bypass conscious control. A person can choose their words, but their nervous system reacts faster than intention. In moments of irritation, disagreement, or vulnerability, contempt can flash across the face before it is masked by neutrality or forced calm. What makes this signal emotionally devastating is its invisibility. You may sense something sharp, dismissive, or cold, but struggle to point to anything concrete. This ambiguity often leads you to doubt yourself rather than trust what you felt. Over time, repeated exposure to contempt, even briefly, can corrode self-worth and emotional safety. Contempt also poisons communication. Once it enters a relationship, curiosity is replaced by judgment, and understanding is replaced by evaluation. Repair becomes unlikely because contempt does not seek resolution, it seeks distance. When contempt appears, even subtly, it marks a dangerous psychological shift. It signals that emotional separation has already begun internally, and betrayal no longer feels like a violation of connection, but a release from it. Subtle contempt in tone. Subtle contempt in tone is one of the most corrosive psychological signals because it communicates superiority without openly declaring it. It appears as faint sarcasm, dismissive inflection, quiet mockery, or a patronizing edge that wasn't there before. The words themselves may seem neutral, but the tone carries a message of irritation, disdain, or emotional distance. This shift often emerges when respect has begun to erode internally. When someone is preparing to detach or justify disloyal thoughts, they unconsciously lower the emotional value of the person they are connected to. Contempt makes that easier. It reframes you as less worthy of care, patience, or consideration, reducing internal resistance to emotional separation. What makes subtle contempt especially triggering is how hard it is to confront. If you point it out, it can be denied or reframed as humor, stress, or misunderstanding. Yet your nervous system registers it immediately. You feel talked down to, minimized, or quietly disrespected, even if you can't quote a specific insult. Over time, this tone reshapes the emotional climate. Conversations feel tense. You may begin second-guessing yourself, feeling embarrassed for expressing needs, or shrinking to avoid being met with that edge again. The relationship stops feeling safe and starts feeling evaluative. Subtle contempt signals that empathy is being replaced by judgment. Once contempt enters, repair becomes difficult, because connection requires equality and care. When tone carries quiet disdain, betrayal no longer feels like a rupture to the person feeling it. It feels like a justified step away from someone they've already emotionally diminished. Indifference to your feelings. Indifference to your feelings is one of the clearest emotional signals that attachment is eroding. Indifference is not anger, and it is not conflict. It is the absence of emotional response where care should exist. When someone stops reacting to your joy, pain, or distress, it reveals that your emotional world no longer holds weight in theirs. This indifference often appears quietly. Your concerns are met with silence, shrugs, or short acknowledgments. Emotional moments that once prompted comfort now receive minimal engagement. Psychologically, this happens when emotional investment has been withdrawn. Feeling with you requires energy, empathy, and presence. When someone is preparing to detach or betray, they often conserve that energy for elsewhere. What makes this signal deeply triggering is how invisible it makes you feel. You may begin questioning whether your emotions are valid or excessive. The lack of response can hurt more than criticism because it suggests you no longer matter enough to provoke any reaction at all. indifference also weakens emotional safety. Without emotional responsiveness, vulnerability feels risky. You may stop sharing your inner experiences, not because you want to, but because there is no emotional return. On a deeper level, indifference functions as emotional insulation. By not feeling your emotions, they protect themselves from guilt and responsibility. It becomes easier to act in ways that hurt you when your feelings are no longer registered internally. When indifference replaces care, betrayal doesn't feel cruel to them. It feels distant, abstract, and emotionally justified. Inconsistent emotional reactions. Inconsistent emotional reactions are a psychological signal that reveal internal instability and divided emotional investment. When someone is emotionally aligned, their responses follow a predictable rhythm. Joy, concern, empathy, and frustration show up in ways that feel coherent over time. When that coherence breaks, emotional reactions begin to feel mismatched and unreliable. This inconsistency often appears as emotional whiplash. A situation that once mattered deeply now receives little reaction, while minor issues suddenly provoke strong responses. Warmth and detachment alternate without clear cause. You may feel as though you never know which version of them you'll encounter in a given moment. Emotionally, this creates unease and hypervigilance. You begin scanning their mood, adjusting your behavior, trying to anticipate reactions to avoid discomfort. This constant emotional recalibration is exhausting and destabilizing, pulling you away from your own emotional needs. Psychologically, inconsistent reactions often indicate internal conflict. The person may be managing guilt, secrecy, or competing emotional attachments. Their emotional system is no longer unified, and that fragmentation leaks out through unpredictable responses. What makes this signal particularly painful is its erosion of emotional safety. Consistency builds trust. When reactions become unreliable, trust weakens, not because of overt harm, but because emotional ground no longer feels solid. Betrayal often manifests emotionally before it becomes visible in action. Inconsistent emotional reactions are the emotional static of a divided mind, revealing that attention, loyalty, or emotional presence is no longer anchored in one place, leaving you navigating a relationship that feels increasingly unstable and uncertain. Sudden philosophical detachment. Sudden philosophical detachment is a psychological distancing maneuver where someone retreats into abstract ideas to avoid emotional accountability. Instead of engaging with lived experience, they begin speaking in concepts, theories, or generalized beliefs. Emotions are reframed as illusions, attachments as weaknesses, and commitment as something constructed rather than chosen. This shift often appears during moments that require personal responsibility. Rather than addressing specific actions or feelings, they zoom out. They talk about how nothing is permanent, how people are just passing through each other's lives, or how expectations are the root of suffering. These ideas may sound thoughtful or enlightened, but psychologically, they function as insulation. Detachment at this level protects the self from guilt. If everything is impermanent and meaning is subjective, then harm loses its weight. Betrayal becomes a philosophical inevitability rather than a personal choice. By abstracting the situation, they avoid confronting the emotional consequences of their behavior. What makes this signal emotionally disorienting is the way it invalidates your experience. Your feelings are not met with empathy, but with ideology. Pain is answered with theory. This can make you feel unsophisticated, emotional, or unreasonable for wanting clarity or care. Sudden philosophical detachment also introduces emotional superiority. They position themselves as evolved, rational, or awakened, while closeness is framed as naive or constricting. This creates distance without overt rejection. This behavior marks a critical internal shift. When someone replaces emotional presence with intellectual distance, they are stepping out of relationship and into self-protection. Betrayal becomes easier when connection is reduced to an idea rather than a lived bond, because ideas can be abandoned without remorse. Avoiding shared spaces. Avoiding shared spaces is a behavioral expression of emotional withdrawal. It shows up as subtle changes in routine, spending more time elsewhere, choosing separate rooms, altering schedules, or finding reasons not to be in the same physical environment. The avoidance doesn't come with explanation. It simply becomes the new normal. Shared spaces represent closeness, familiarity, and unfiltered presence. When someone begins to avoid them, it often reflects discomfort with intimacy rather than a need for solitude. Being physically near you requires emotional consistency. When that consistency is missing, proximity feels exposing. This behavior often develops when someone is trying to manage internal conflict. Shared spaces increase the chance of conversation, observation, and emotional engagement. Avoidance reduces those risks. Distance becomes a way to maintain control and prevent moments that could invite questions or reveal emotional shifts. What makes this signal emotionally painful is how it alters the sense of togetherness. You may begin feeling alone even when not technically alone. Familiar environments feel emptier, and connection feels conditional on circumstance rather than desire. You start noticing how much effort it takes to occupy the same space. Over time, avoiding shared spaces rewires the relationship. Togetherness becomes rare and intentional instead of natural. You adapt by lowering expectations, filling the silence, or creating your own distance to cope. In that growing separation, betrayal becomes easier to conceal because the relationship has already been divided physically and emotionally, one avoided room or missed moment at a time. Making unilateral decisions. Making unilateral decisions is a psychological shift that signals emotional separation before physical or verbal separation occurs. In healthy bonds, decisions are shared because shared reality matters. When someone begins deciding without you, especially on matters that affect both of you, it reveals that they no longer see you as part of their inner decision-making world. This behavior often starts subtly. Plans are made without consultation. Choices are presented as fate's accomplice rather than discussions. When questioned, the response is practical or dismissive, as if your input is optional. Psychologically, this reflects a recentering of the self. Their priorities, desires, and future are being organized independently. What makes this signal emotionally triggering is the loss of agency it creates. You may feel sidelined, powerless, or suddenly irrelevant in situations where you once had a voice. This can create a quiet grief as you realize that inclusion has been replaced by notification. Unilateral decision-making also reduces accountability. When someone stops collaborating, they stop emotionally considering how choices affect you. This makes it easier to justify decisions that benefit them while disadvantaging the relationship. On a deeper level, this behavior rehearses separation. By acting alone, they practice life without you while still maintaining the appearance of togetherness. Each solo decision weakens the shared foundation and strengthens their independence. When someone consistently chooses without you, it signals that loyalty is no longer mutual, and betrayal becomes less a rupture and more a continuation of the direction they've already been moving. Less curiosity about your life. Less curiosity about your life is a psychological signal that reveals emotional disengagement through absence rather than conflict. Curiosity is one of the clearest expressions of care. When someone is emotionally invested, they naturally want to know how you feel, what you're thinking, and what is happening in your world. When that curiosity fades, it signals that attention has quietly shifted elsewhere. This change often shows up in small moments. They stop asking follow-up questions. Your stories receive acknowledgement without interest. Important events in your life are remembered vaguely or not at all. The exchange becomes one-sided, where you listen more than you are listened to. Emotionally, this can feel deeply invalidating. Being known is a core human need, and curiosity is how that knowing is sustained. When it disappears, you may begin to feel invisible or emotionally unnecessary, even if the relationship technically continues. Psychologically, reduced curiosity reflects emotional withdrawal. Attention is a limited resource. When it is consistently directed away from you, it often indicates that emotional energy is being invested elsewhere, whether internally or externally. The bond weakens not because of hostility, but because of neglect. What makes this signal particularly painful is its quietness. There is no argument to address, no behavior to confront directly. The absence of interest is harder to name, yet more revealing than overt rejection. Betrayal often begins with emotional detachment. When curiosity about your inner world fades, it signals that the emotional thread connecting you is thinning, leaving space for disconnection to deepen while you are left wondering when you stopped being someone they wanted to truly know. Becoming transactional. Becoming transactional is a psychological shift where connection is replaced by calculation. Relationships thrive on goodwill, generosity, and unspoken care. When someone begins measuring interactions in terms of exchange, what they give versus what they get, it signals that emotional investment is being withdrawn and replaced with self-interest. This change often reveals itself quietly. Support comes with conditions. Effort is offered only when it benefits them. Acts of care are followed by expectations, reminders, or subtle tallies. What once felt freely given now feels negotiated, as if every interaction carries an invisible invoice. Psychologically, transactional behavior reduces vulnerability. Genuine connection requires trust and emotional exposure. When someone is preparing to detach or justify disloyalty, turning the relationship into a series of exchanges creates emotional distance. It reframes the bond as a contract rather than a commitment. What makes this signal emotionally unsettling is the erosion of safety it creates. You may begin questioning whether affection is sincere or strategic. Instead of feeling valued for who you are, you feel valued for what you provide. This can lead to anxiety, overgiving, or withdrawal as you try to restore balance. Becoming transactional also allows moral justification. If the relationship is framed as unequal or unfulfilling, then seeking fulfillment elsewhere feels reasonable. Emotional debts are exaggerated. Contributions are minimized. The narrative shifts from shared life to unfair exchange. Over time, warmth is replaced by negotiation. Care is replaced by cost-benefit thinking. This psychological shift makes betrayal easier because loyalty no longer feels like devotion, but like a transaction that can be canceled once it stops paying the desired return. Emotionally checking out. Emotionally checking out is the moment presence becomes hollow. The person is there in body, in routine, in obligation, but not in feeling. Their responses are minimal, their reactions muted, and their engagement feels delayed or absent. You may speak and be heard, but not truly received. This shift happens when emotional investment has already been withdrawn internally. Rather than confronting conflict or making decisions, the mind chooses disengagement. It's a psychological exit that avoids accountability while maintaining appearances. By checking out emotionally, they no longer have to feel the weight of connection, guilt, or responsibility. What makes this signal deeply unsettling is the loneliness it creates inside the relationship itself. You may find yourself trying harder to spark emotion, to provoke reaction, or to feel something real again. The absence feels colder than anger because anger still implies care. Emotional numbness does not. Emotionally checking out also protects internal narratives. If they don't feel deeply, they don't have to question why. Detachment becomes a buffer against self-reflection. Your needs, pain, or concern can be acknowledged intellectually without being felt emotionally. Over time, this emotional absence reshapes the dynamic. You begin grieving the connection while it technically still exists. The relationship becomes a shell, familiar but empty. Betrayal doesn't always arrive as a sudden act. Sometimes it follows a long emotional departure, where one person has already left in every way that matters, leaving the other to slowly realize they're alone with someone who has already gone. Downplaying commitments. Downplaying commitments is a psychological softening of responsibility that often appears before loyalty is broken outright. Commitments represent intention, continuity, and accountability. When someone begins minimizing their importance, they are quietly loosening the emotional ties that bind them to you. This behavior shows up in language first. Promises are reframed as not a big deal. Plans that once mattered are treated as flexible or optional. Shared goals are spoken about with detachment or uncertainty. Psychologically, this allows the person to reduce internal pressure. If commitments are insignificant, then breaking them doesn't feel like a violation. What makes this signal emotionally destabilizing is how it erodes trust without confrontation. You may feel foolish for caring, overly sensitive for remembering, or demanding for expecting follow-through. This subtly shifts responsibility onto you for valuing what was once mutual. Downplaying commitments also creates emotional ambiguity. When nothing feels solid, you stop relying on the relationship for stability. You begin bracing for disappointment rather than expecting consistency. This keeps you emotionally guarded while they move with increasing freedom. On a deeper level, minimizing commitments serves as psychological rehearsal. It prepares both of you for the idea that bonds are temporary and obligations are negotiable. By redefining commitment as optional, they create emotional permission to step away without guilt. When commitments lose their weight, loyalty soon follows, because loyalty cannot survive where promises are treated as disposable. Increased deception confidence. Increased deception confidence is a psychological signal that appears when dishonesty no longer feels risky to the person engaging in it. Early deception is often accompanied by anxiety, hesitation, or overcorrection. When deception becomes familiar, those signs fade, replaced by smoother delivery, steadier tone, and a noticeable lack of discomfort. This shift happens as the mind adapts. Repeated deception desensitizes guilt and fear, allowing lies, omissions, or half-truths to be delivered with calm certainty. Stories are told without hesitation. Explanations sound polished rather than thoughtful. The emotional friction that once existed between truth and falsehood begins to dissolve. Emotionally, this is unsettling because confidence is often associated with honesty. When someone lies convincingly, it creates a painful contradiction. You may feel that something is off, yet struggle to justify that feeling because their demeanor appears composed and assured. This disconnect can make you doubt your instincts. Psychologically, increased confidence in deception reflects internal justification. The person has reframed their behavior in a way that preserves their self-image. Once the mind believes the lie is necessary, harmless, or deserved, it no longer signals distress. What makes this signal particularly dangerous is its effectiveness. Confident deception reduces scrutiny. It discourages questions. It creates an illusion of transparency while concealing distortion underneath. Betrayal becomes easier when dishonesty feels safe. Increased deception confidence signals that the internal barrier against lying has weakened, allowing concealment to feel routine rather than morally disruptive, and leaving you navigating a reality shaped by conviction rather than truth. Lack of remorse for small harms. Lack of remorse for small harms is a psychological numbing process that often precedes larger violations. Small harms are moral checkpoints. They test whether empathy, accountability, and care are still active. When someone no longer reacts to these moments with concern or repair, it signals that emotional sensitivity is fading. This often shows up as indifference. Hurtful comments are brushed off. Broken promises are minimized. Minor betrayals of trust are treated as inconveniences rather than wounds. Instead of acknowledgement or apology, you receive justification, dismissal, or silence. Psychologically, remorse requires emotional presence. It demands that a person register the impact of their behavior and feel it. When internal conflict or self-interest begins to dominate, that emotional feedback loop weakens. The mind prioritizes self-protection over relational repair, and empathy becomes optional. What makes this signal emotionally distressing is its subtlety. Because the harms are small, you may question whether your reaction is valid. You may lower your expectations, accept less repair, or tell yourself it's not worth addressing. Over time, this trains you to tolerate disregard. Lack of remorse also rewires moral boundaries. If small harms do not matter, larger ones begin to feel less significant. Each unacknowledged injury becomes a rehearsal for deeper indifference. This pattern does not appear suddenly at the moment of betrayal. It develops gradually as emotional responsiveness dulls. When someone can cause minor pain without pause or regret, it signals that the internal brakes of care are wearing down, making more serious harm psychologically easier to commit without feeling its weight. Emotional numbness toward you. Emotional numbness toward you is not loud or dramatic. It is cold, quiet, and deeply unsettling. Reactions that once carried warmth now feel flat. Your emotions no longer move them the way they used to. Joy, sadness, concern, or vulnerability are met with neutrality, as if they are being observed rather than felt. This numbness often forms as a psychological defense. When someone is suppressing guilt, conflict, or desire that contradicts their values, emotional shutdown becomes a coping mechanism. Feeling less makes it easier to avoid inner discomfort. Unfortunately, that shutdown rarely stays contained. It spreads outward, directly affecting the person closest to them. What makes this signal emotionally painful is how invisible it can feel. There is no argument, no rejection, no clear explanation. You may begin wondering if you're being too sensitive or if your emotions are asking for too much. Over time, this uncertainty chips away at your sense of emotional worth. Emotional numbness also removes emotional feedback loops. When your feelings no longer register, connection weakens, empathy fades, responsiveness disappears. You may feel like you're speaking into a void where nothing echoes back. As this numbness persists, the relationship loses its emotional pulse. You stop feeling chosen, valued, or emotionally held. Betrayal becomes easier in this state, not because of cruelty, but because emotional detachment has already done the work of severing connection. When someone no longer feels your emotions, crossing emotional boundaries no longer feels like crossing anything at all.